Good morning, everybody. We're thrilled to welcome you to this training on investigative interviews with suspected child victims of trafficking. Good morning, everybody. We're thrilled to welcome you to... There we go. My name is Shauna von Blixen. I come from the Council of the Baltic Sea States, which is an intergovernmental organization that promotes many things throughout the Baltic Sea region and beyond. One of those things is children at risk, which is where I work. And in that unit, I have a second hat, which is as the coordinator of the Promise Barnahus network. Now, this network, as many of you, I'm sure, are aware, is promoting the Barnahus model throughout Europe, and is also inspiring other places in the world to consider the model and to take it on. And this network of Barnahus and stakeholders who are active in promoting the model in one way or another has one of many current activities is looking at the role of Barnahus when it comes to victims of trafficking. A few of the things that this project is developing includes national referral mechanism models. It's looking at adding the children aspect to existing transnational referral mechanisms. And it's also looking at guidance and good practice in actually meeting child victims of trafficking in Barnahus. And so that is the context for why we are all here today. A little bit about all of you. We have more than 120 people registered today. Many of you have experience with meeting child victims of trafficking. For many of you, this is something that you haven't done yet, but you might be doing in the future, or it is relevant to your work. We have many participants from Barnahus, from around Europe, also from government agencies, from NGOs, and some private companies as well. And last I checked, we had, I think, 25 or 26 countries represented in the participants list. So we're really thrilled to have such a broad group represented here today. This training is being recorded for future purposes, for sharing and using in other contexts as well. Please make sure that you click on the globe icon in the Zoom platform here to select English or Romanian language, so that if the interpreters are helping, for example, to translate a question, then you'll be able to hear what that question is. Instead of using the chat today, we will be using the Q&A feature. You'll find that button as well in the bottom bar. And now, without further ado, I'm really thrilled to introduce you to Julia Korkman, who is a licensed psychologist and docent in forensic psychology, who has actively worked with investigations of suspected crimes against children. And her career has included researching legal psychological issues regarding testimony and interviewing in criminal investigations, eyewitness identifications, asylum processes, reliability assessments, factors linked to crimes against children, and factors that are linked to rape victims' propensity to report or not report their experiences. She has trained judges, prosecutors, police officers, lawyers, social and healthcare workers, as well as university students. and has planned the Finnish specialization training in forensic psychology. And now you will be exposed to her brilliance today. Over to you, Julia.
Thank you so much, Shauna. And I'm thrilled to be here today. And I sincerely hope that there will be something for everyone to take on board. I'm just checking, Shauna. Do you hear me well?
I hear you well, and I see you well.
I know we have a varied group of participants or participants with very varied experience. So I hope, as I said, that there will be something for everyone. And I am currently working with this set of recommendations, or we call it handbook. I don't know what the final word will be for it, but about investigative interviewing in trafficking cases. And I do find it very fascinating. It's also challenging from the point of view that there is still rather scarce research on this particular theme. There is some research on investigative interviews with trafficking victims in general, but few, very few, on investigative interviews with children who are suspected of being victims of trafficking. Sean already introduced me, so I think I don't need to say much more. Maybe what I could still say is that currently I'm working with HEUNI, which is the European Institute for Criminal Policy and Control, affiliated with the United Nations. And within that context, I'm working with projects related to, among other things, violence against migrant women, and also together with the Promise Network and CVSS on both a project related to online sexual abuse of children and investigating trafficking against children. And I also continue doing research with an affiliation at the Åbo Academy University, where child victims continue to be one of the main topics of focus. And we also, Shauna mentioned the other research projects. I think in this context, the most perhaps informative and interesting research project we have ongoing is a project related to asylum interviews and decisions. So we are looking at a large material consisting of asylum cases. We have analyzed the asylum interviews and looked at also at the decisions, how the asylum applicants' accounts have been analyzed and how their credibility has been assessed. And I think there's quite a lot of relevance in that research also for the context of trafficking, of course, as many of the trafficking victims are in fact asylum seekers or foreign-born individuals. But yes, so I'll show you the topics of today. I will talk about first general things about interviewing children in criminal investigations. I know these are topics that are for some are already well known, but I'll try to be brief and concise. And there is also some very, very fresh information or research output in this context, namely the European Association of Psychology and Law, for which I'm soon to be the president, which is a society for academics within the field of psychology and law, are about to launch a set of a white paper, a set of recommendations on how child investigative interviews should be conducted. So I will talk a bit about these. And then I will look I will do a snapshot on the research of investigating trafficking in children and youth. I will go through some examples of trafficking of children. Then I will talk about particular vulnerabilities, and in particular the question of psychological coercion and control. And at least here in Finland, and my impression is this is also globally the situation, there has been an increasing understanding in the fact that these so-called invisible chains, this fact that many trafficking victims can really be controlled by perpetrators psychologically. This is very hard for our criminal justice system to observe and to quantify and to make visible and to tackle, and that this is an area where much training is needed. I think, at least here in Finland, it's been really a topic that this last year has been on the rise, and I've gotten quite a few requests for talking about this topic, which is of course no easy topic for the criminal justice system. An example of psychological control would be, for example, in an online sexual abuse case where the perpetrator forces the child to do sexual acts, and although they are not in the same physical location, the perpetrator can get into a relationship with the child where they have this control. It can be through threats, it can be through a positive relation, or like building a sort of positive relationship, and then sort of manipulating the child into doing things. So this is, I think, one of the whereas many of the things related to investigative interviewing are the same for many types of cases, I think the question of psychological control is particularly relevant in the case of trafficking, also in other types, in labor trafficking, etc. But we'll come to that later today. I will also actually already here at the beginning, these are not in the order I will present them, but I will talk about memory aspects of relevance when interviewing possible victims of trafficking. I think these basic concepts of memory and language are always really important to go through. And then lastly, and hopefully I will leave enough time for this, I will talk about cultural aspects and working with interpreters. This is one of the themes where I think a lot can be done to develop our investigations, and a lot really needs to be done. And also I will say a few words about assessing credibility and just some very main issues, such as how emotional expressions sometimes are maybe mistakenly interpreted, and also touch upon the perfect victim myth. Okay, but basic things about child interviewing. Child interviewing has been researched for even more than a century already. In the beginning, like around 1900, there were quite interesting books written touching upon the issue of child witnesses. For example, in France, the famous psychologist Alfred Binet published a book called La Suggestibilité, Suggestibility, where he, among other things, expressed the concern that if young children are asked questions in very leading or suggestive ways, then it's highly likely that their accounts will be altered and they may develop false understandings or memories of issues. So this has been known for a very long time, and during the last decades there has been a substantial amount of research looking at young child victims and witnesses and how they best can be interviewed. And I would say the focus has been quite a bit on younger children, which is maybe understandable, as they are, in terms of age, highly vulnerable. But I will also talk a little bit about concerns related to adolescents. And another thing to note is that the bulk of the research has been on child victims and child witnesses, and much less effort has been made to research young suspects. And we do know that there are children who are suspects of crimes and who are interrogated by the police, sometimes in very harsh and coercive ways. The Fundamental Rights Agency in Europe launched a report recently about how children in different European countries are met with the criminal justice system when suspects of crimes. And the report clearly showed that there is a lot to be developed and that these children's rights are not always protected. I think this is important to raise in the context of trafficking investigations, as we know that among trafficking victims, we also have children who are forced into criminal activities or manipulated into criminal activities. So they may be met as suspects by the criminal justice system, where they maybe should be met as victims. We have throughout Europe and the US, and also in countries in Asia, for example, had cases during the last decades where it's been clear that less than optimal interviewing methods have led to very problematic results. So these, you can see here, these are all famous cases in different parts of Europe and the US where there has been a suspicion of child abuse or of a crime. Children have been interviewed or interrogated, and this has led to a completely wrong outcome. The Kevin case in Sweden, which is up on the left of the screen, is a bit particular because in that case the children were actually suspected of having killed their very young friend. These boys were 5 and 7 when they were interrogated by the police, both 15 times each. And in the end, the police came to the conclusion that they had, as they said, confessed to the crime. But looking at the interviews, it was quite clear that they were very, very harshly manipulated by the police. And the smaller boy, the 5-year-old boy called Robin, he was, as any 5-year-old would probably be, he was very suggestible. He was quite social and really trying to be to fulfill his duties as a witness. So he was going along with anything the police suggested. And the 7-year-old bigger brother, he was much more resistant and resilient in terms of suggestion. So he really tried to say that he doesn't think they killed their friend. This was 20 years ago, and some now recently, a few years ago, a new investigation showed that in fact they had never confessed, but been really subject to very leading investigative interviews or interrogations, and this they were now freed from all the suspicions. But their life have been quite shadowed by this. And they are not alone. There are many other instances in which young children have been interviewed. And these other cases you see here on the screen, it's the McMartin case in the US, which is probably the most famous case gone wrong. And I'll say a few words about that soon. Then we have the case that Outreau in France, Bjugn in Norway, and Rignano in Italy. And these are just a few examples, but all of these are connected by the fact that these cases came forward so that there was a real concern, a real worry that young children would have been sexually abused. And children were then interviewed, and the interviews showed that the children in fact had been abused. In other words, in the interviews, the children said things that were interpreted as evidence that the children had been abused. And in some of these cases, adults were then waiting for trials for many, many years. For example, in the McMartin preschool case, 7 persons who were members of the daycare personnel were jailed for many years waiting for the court proceedings, and one of them died in prison. And in the end, it became obvious that no sexual abuse had taken place. The reason I'm talking about these cases is that there is a risk where where we as a society have a worry and a concern and a want to protect children, but if it's not paired with knowledge about how to do these investigations, they really might go in the wrong direction. So in the case of McMartin, it started with a young boy whose mother was worried that he might have been sexually abused by his father. This was within the context of a custody dispute. And he was very little, preschool aged. And at some point, her suspicion also came to incorporate one of the members of the daycare personnel a man who was working at the daycare. At some point, the boy was interviewed, and then the police, he was interviewed in a highly suggestive way, and he said he then went along with the interviewer's suggestions, and the interviewers assessed that he had in fact been sexually abused. The police then wrote a letter to all the parents who had or had children in McMartin and said that we have reason to suspect that children have been sexually abused in our daycare setting. And they also listed what kind of abuse they suspected having taken place. And then they asked all the parents to talk to their children and ask them if they had been sexually abused. And you can probably imagine what happens if you ask very young children, if the parents are worried and they ask them, has this happened to you? The risk, of course, is enormous that children go along with what their parents suggest, and parents are not experts in child interviewing. It's very human if you are worried about your child that you may pose very suggestive and leading questions. In the end, the suspicion became very widespread. So there was a suspicion that several hundred children would have been sexually abused by all the members of the preschool, of the daycare personnel. And the children's accounts became more and more unrealistic. They included being flown with helicopters to other places to be abused. They were claiming that there were tunnels that were digged under the daycare, for which the children were taken somewhere, or that they were put into the toilet and flushed somewhere else. So of course, at some point, critical voices started asking whether we should have a more critical look at this case. And it became quite evident that every detail that could be checked against facts was not true. The good, how would I say, this was a very tragical case, but it did result in quite a bit of research on child victims, because it became apparent that the child interviewers in this case, who were using so-called anatomically detailed dolls, and you probably all know these are dolls with genitals, so they are otherwise like normal dolls, but they have genitals with pubic hair and everything. And these interviewers, social workers, interviewed the children using dolls, and this was in the 1990s, where we had much less information on how children should be interviewed. So they used quite a bit of leading questions and positive and negative reinforcement. So if they asked the child, has anyone done bad things to you at the daycare, the child would say no, and then the interviewer would say, are you sure? Now think really thoroughly about it. Or all your friends have told me that he did really bad things. Now you should also be a brave boy and tell me. And of course, young children are incredibly susceptible to this kind of suggestion. And this is probably what explained the whole tragedy of McMartin, and what is also likely to be behind these other cases in which it's become clear later on that the abuse suspicion does not hold true. This then led, as I said, to significant research, because researchers became interested in the investigative interviews that had been conducted within the McMartin case, and analyzed them, and found that using this kind of leading questions, anatomically detailed dolls, giving the child a sort of positive feedback if they said something bad, or negative feedback if they said nothing had happened, children really can make up a lot of things. This has now been very clearly demonstrated also in the so-called laboratory setting. In other words, in the context where researchers perform controlled tests. So some researchers have done studies where they have had, for example, an adult person coming into a classroom doing nice things with the children, and 1 week later the children have been interviewed about this interaction, and some of them have been suggested that the man would have done something bad or something evil, and these children have been quite implicated, or have quite easily started saying the man in fact did bad things and made up things that were bad. Later on, I mean, this was maybe like the first wave, I would say, of research focused largely on how easily suggested children are. And I think based on only that research, you might even come to the conclusion that it's really dangerous to interview young children, and you should maybe not think they are reliable as witnesses. This, however, is not the case, and it's quite clear that we have a lot of cases where the child is the only witness to the event, and we really need children's statements to ensure that they can be safe. So the next wave of research then focused on how to make sure that investigative interviews are conducted in a way that does not hamper the child's account, that does not include all these dangerous interviewing methods. And in the case of child sexual abuse investigations, a book edited by Catherine Quenley and Mary Connell in 2009 is, I think, still one of the best pieces that has been written. It goes very nicely through both children's sexual behavior, what to think of that, on hypothesis testing, which means exploring alternative explanations to the allegation, etc., and the core issues of child witnesses and child interviewing. So this is a strong recommendation. And of course, I think all people who have been working with or in Barnahus are very acquainted with this interviewing protocol, the NICHD interviewing guide. This was also developed as a response to the concerns followed by the McMartin case and similar cases. So the whole idea of the protocol was to not only come with warnings to interviewers on what not to do, but really to help them then conduct investigative interviews that are good, that do avoid these sort of problems or problematic interviewing strategies. There are several other similar interviewing protocols developed, and many of them are also very similar. They share the same general principles. They talk about rapport building and posing open-ended questions. I will go into that a bit later also. The NICHD is the one that has been most extensively researched, but the main idea, the most important thing is that the main principles are adhered to. As I said, the European Association of Psychology and Law is now launching a white paper on child interviewing. So we have scientists, researchers from all over Europe working on child interviewing issues, who together have drafted a paper on the most important points that we really would like policy makers and practitioners to be mindful of, and these go very nicely, I think, in line with the Barnahus standards, and hopefully will complement and sort of detail the Barnahus interviewing standards. And I think there's also a very good possibility for us to make sure that scientists throughout Europe are connected to the practitioners in the different European countries. The key points in the EAPL white paper are following. The interviews need to be carried out by trained professionals. These professionals need to be aware of child memory, suggestibility, language development, the importance of rapport building, etc. There are many other things as well. But the main point is to say that you cannot take just any police officer, psychologist, social worker and tell them that they should interview children. They really need to know what they are doing. We also, of course, recommend evidence-based interviewing, and the NICHD is particularly mentioned as it is the one that has most evidence-based at this point of time. Most importantly, the interviews need to be non-leading, trauma-informed in the sense that they take into account the child's individual situation and also are sensitive to topics that can be quite difficult to talk about. We strongly urge that interviews all over Europe, why not globally, should be electronically recorded, and that there's a need for a change in the criminal justice processes. We strongly recommend that child interviews are recorded and used as evidence in chief in court proceedings, or that's at least in countries where the processes take a long time and where the actual court proceeding cannot be arranged in a child-friendly way. We know from some research, for example, in Scotland, that children's experiences of being cross-examined in court have been quite negative, and the questions posed can be quite unsuited for children. We also emphasize the need to recognize the risk of bias, for example, as in the McMartin case, where there was a strong will to help children. Nothing was done out of bad intention. It was all done to protect children. But if there is not an awareness that, for example, that there may be alternative explanations behind an allegation or a suspicion, then it is there is a risk that evidence is collected only to strengthen one's own hypothesis. So this is really important: risk of bias and the need to test different alternative explanations, also within the investigative interview. So this is written quite largely about a comfortable and calm interview setting, which means children should not be interviewed in rooms full of toys or distractors. This is, I think, one of the core issues or core principles of the Barnahus system, and something that has developed tremendously. I think most countries strive, at least, to having children heard in child-friendly and calm locations rather than very scary police stations, for instance. We do not recommend the use of dolls or props in the interviews, with the maybe exception of potentially using pictures where the child can point at body parts, just to make sure we understand what term they are using. But also this only at a later stage in the interview. And we do not recommend the use of anatomically detailed dolls. There are quite a lot of studies showing that they come with a risk of suggestion and of increased errors in the children's accounts. We also emphasize that interviewers should, in addition to be trained, they should receive continuous assessment and feedback. And this is, of course, one of the more difficult parts, as it is costly. But everything that can be done should be done in order to ensure that interviewers, at least with some intervals, get feedback on their interviews, and so they keep up with what they have learned. We know from research that interviewers who are very well trained and develop a good quality in their interviews, they are good in creating report, and they pose mostly open-ended questions. If they are not, if they don't receive any feedback or continuous training sessions, the quality of their interviews is likely to start falling, unfortunately. So there has to be these kinds of sessions, of refreshing sessions every now and then. And I think here we probably have much to do all over Europe. This is, as I said, costly. It's complicated, but we need to try to develop this. It's also recommended that only the child and the interviewer are present in the interviewing room. Of course, if there's an interpreter, then the interpreter should also be in that room. It is not recommended that the child has their parents with them. And I'm sure there can be situations where it's not a problem if the parents are present, but there are concerns, and there are some research findings that, for example, if a parent is present, the child might talk less, which in a way is logical. For smaller children, for example, the fact that the parent is there usually is a signal that, well, the mother knows. Why should I be? Why don't ask her? So if a child has told something to their parent and the parent is there, the child might very well expect the parent to talk in their place. This would be normal for a child if going to the doctor, for example. Another thing is that, in particular, in the case of slightly older children and adolescents, the abuse might have to do with things that the child has done without the knowledge of the parents. For example, an adolescent having having had alcohol with some adults, and then this situation has led to abuse. And well, if the adolescent knows that the parents have told them not to drink alcohol or not to go with strangers anywhere, they might be ashamed to talk about this when the parents are present. Thirdly, from my own interviewing experience, I've seen both situations in which, for example, a parent comes with the child to the waiting room of the interviewing center, and the parent is clearly very nervous about the interview, and the child also seems very nervous, and the parent says, well, he's so scared to come here, and I don't know how he's going to do, and maybe I should come along. And once you get the parent slightly calmer and removed from the interview room, at least in some cases, it was obvious that the child was actually more relaxed when the parent was not there. So sometimes it's the parent's nervosity that actually is a problem, more so than the child's, and the child can actually be quite calmed by an interviewer who then seems really calm about the situation. So the idea that some people express that it's always more safe for the child to have a parent with them, in my more practical experience, it really doesn't hold true. There's also, I also remember a case where a teenager was telling about abusive events, and her mother was sitting behind her. This was so many years ago in a police interview, and the mother was completely silent and did not interact or interfere in any way. So she was acting as good as one can in that situation. But from the video, you could see that she had silent tears running down her cheek. So the recommendation is that only the child and the interviewer should be in the interviewing room. And in some countries, there's a use of intermediaries, of which there's not so much research. The research that there is shows that indeed they can be helpful in situations where the one posing the questions to the child is not a professional. But I think the general perception is that the best thing is to have a well-trained interviewer alone in a calm room with the child. So this would be our hope for the development of Europe in terms of child interviewing, largely. Interpreters, I will talk about interpreters today quite a bit because they are very, very relevant in many of the trafficking investigations. But we do argue that interpreters should also have specialized training in child interviewing, and that interviews, when they are interpreter assisted, should be seen as a common endeavor. So interpreters and interviewers should have time to plan together to discuss topics that will be raised in the interview. But I will talk much more about that today. We worked quite a bit on the question of online interviewing and came to the conclusion that we have a very short paragraph about that, stating that there is quite some promising research. There really, in the future, there might be very good ways and child-friendly ways of doing investigative interviews with children online. And there have been also quite a few examples where this practice has had very nice results. But it might be too early to make general recommendations, and there are still quite a few concerns also related to online investigative interviewing. So we are sort of waiting for more research, and maybe in the future there will be another paper more focusing on this aspect. And the last point is that there's been most research about investigative interviews with child victims of physical or sexual abuse, but the same general principles should apply for all contexts where children are interviewed, including custody disputes or child protective service interviews, or indeed cases where children are suspects. So that was a sort of general brief about child interviewing. We'll take a very short break and maybe 10 minutes break now, and then continue with memory aspects of relevance when interviewing possible victims of trafficking. So I will talk about memory aspects of relevance when interviewing actually any children in forensic investigations, but also raising some issues that are particularly relevant for victims of trafficking. And in particular, compared to, for example, the NICHD protocol has been developed in a way that nicely fits situations where there is a clear a suspicion of, for example, one or a few clear incidents of abuse, but when there are situations of abuse that occur repeatedly during the course of a long time, then that affects memory and how we can retrieve memories, and this needs to be taken into consideration. Someone beautifully said that memories are like a snowy landscape, meaning that we can never go back to the landscape as it was immediately after we experienced something or saw something. Every time we talk about the event, even when we think about it, if we read about it, etc., the memory might be changed to some extent. We always make a kind of a new interpretation of it. As you can see, the general landscape still looks the same, but something has been changed, and we can't go back to the original memory. And this has to be understood. I think it's not a disaster. I think it would though be good if the criminal justice system understood better that this is a key feature of human memory. We see far too often that victims' credibility is assessed with the notion that memories have to be sort of steady over time, that there shouldn't be discrepancies, for example. But if a person talks about something that has happened many years ago during the course of many months or even years, it is to be expected that there will be some changes, not in the main issues, not in the most important issues, but in details for sure. And I think this overall, there is a kind of there are too big expectations on human memory, and to some extent there are wrongful expectations on human memory in society at large, and especially in the criminal justice process. And we would need to change them a bit. In our research project on asylum interviews, we have looked at interviews, also trying to see what kinds of expectations there are on the applicants' memories. And this is just one of many examples where I think it's clear that the question doesn't really resonate with what we know about human memory. What I mean is, how did your father's parents treat your mother when you were 2 years and still lived in wherever? It's obvious that this is not something probably anyone would be able to answer. First of all, we do not generally have any memories from when we were 2 years old. The development of language is very connected to memory, or the other way around. When a child learns to talk about their experiences, they also become better at creating memories of these events. So this also it means that in social contexts, in families where children are asked to tell about their experiences, or where parents go through the children's experiences with them, the children create stronger memories of experiences, and they also sort of learn to create these memory narratives, so to say. They learn to, how do you say, build memories. And there seems to be some cross cultural variation in terms, for example, of the earliest memories. It seems that Ki Wang is one of the researchers who has researched the effects of culture on children's memory in particular. There's very interesting research on that. And she's noted, among other things, that basic mechanisms of memory and issues such as suggestibility, or the fact that we don't generally remember our very first years, they are quite certainly general for all human beings. But the ways in which memory develops is also very social, and this, of course, can vary among cultures. I think it was Ki Wang and her colleagues who studied adults who had been raised in traditional Chinese surroundings compared to Northern American persons, noting that the Chinese participants had slightly later first memories, so they did not have as early childhood memories as the American participants, and also that the Chinese participants, their first memories were much more linked to the social context rather than to their own person, what they themselves had done. And this could very well be understood in the context of how children are encouraged to talk about themselves and what they have done. So if we have, for example, a family context where children should not be, in Finland, the saying was previously that children should be seen, not heard. Luckily, this has changed. But if that's the kind of cultural context, of course, children will not be very good at describing their own deeds for adults, at least. So there are cultural considerations to keep in mind. The question of from which age we can remember things has been discussed for some time. It's called infantile amnesia. And for a long time, it was thought that we don't remember events prior to the age of 3 or 4. And actually, this has slightly changed during the last years. We also know, of course, there's a great variation among individuals. We also know that when a child is still a child, of course, they can remember back to a 3-year-old can remember what happened to them when they were 2.5. But most of these memories are then gradually forgotten if they are not sort of kept alive. But there is now some new evidence showing that actually it seems that we post-date our first memories, which means that we that we think events have happened later than they actually have. So it's possible and indeed probable that our first memories can very well be from the age of maybe 2 to 3. According to some studies, adults seem to think they have memories from when they were very young, before 1 year of age. And I think in light of any memory research, I know this is not particularly likely. We simply do not seem to be able to create memories that we could sort of that would be explicit enough for us to remember when we are adults before we learn how to talk. And we also know there's quite a lot of research on false memories. For example, we know that people sometimes think they have a memory for something, and it can turn out that they were not even born when the event had happened. They had just heard so much about the event, they actually thought they were there. And still the memory can seem quite vivid. I think it's always hard when you think of if you think of your own first memory. For most of us, it's hard to figure out whether we actually remember a situation or whether we remember a photo or an anecdote. It's been talked about in the family. And in normal life, of course, that's not the most relevant thing in the world. But in suspicions of child abuse, for example, this of course becomes really, really crucial. Sometimes I've been asked, whether children have poor memory, and I don't think I don't think that's the case. Actually, children learn tremendous amounts of information every day, but of course they lack a broader perspective. They lack knowledge about the world, where to sort of put all that new information. So it hampers a broader understanding of what they have been through. And they lack strategies to retrieve memories and to tell what they know. So childhood memories can be sort of fragmentary because of this lack. It's like if you went to a lecture, those of you who are very into investigative interviewing, who have been to many trainings before, you will know probably most of what I'm saying, but there will be likely some new things, and you will be quite able to add them with ease to your own knowledge base. But if there was someone here who has never heard about child interviewing, this would probably be very, very difficult to take in, and there would be only a few small examples that maybe would remain with them. And this is where children are, sort of developmentally speaking. And of course, among children, there are big variations also within and between individuals. Yeah. So a composer who goes to a concert will be able to remember much more about what happened in the music, because they are able to see if, it was a transition from one, kind of music to another, or change of tempo, etc. While a person who is more ignorant in terms of musical theory would only know if it was pretty or not, or touching or not. Children also have difficulties with what is known as source monitoring, and this is incredibly crucial in investigative interviewing. So if a child says, well, my father beat me many times, we'd still have to realize, or to try to understand, whether this is something the child has heard or actually has experienced. This is maybe one of the most typical questions in child abuse investigations, especially if it's a context where we know that another parent, for example, has been worried about the child and might have posed suggestive questions. And in some interviews, you can actually maybe even find out this. You can ask the child, well, tell me again how you know about these things. And maybe the child says, well, my father told me that this is what has happened. Or then, well, I was there and it hurt me when he hit me. And then it's quite clear. It's a sort of, well, it's much more likely that it's a self-experienced event. It should be noted that all people have problems with source monitoring. As I said, I think probably many of us have memories that we now put in the wrong context, or that we think we remember happening to ourselves. Well, in fact, they have happened to someone else. There are numerous examples of these kinds of monitoring errors. And I think the most everyday example is that you leave your home and then you start wondering whether you actually turned off the coffee maker or not, because you've done it so many times. And did you do it this morning? So did you just think about doing it, or did you do it? Or sending an email, did you do it, or did you just think you should do it? Anyway, these are, or did you read something from a tabloid or a scientific source? That's sort of important to keep track of, but it can be difficult. Here we have a girl who's 4 years old. This is in the context where a mother suspects the father of having abused the child. And the mother has made she has recorded their discussion and given this record to the police, with the idea that this sort of that the child is actually telling that her father has abused her. So they first, the mother says, yes, so your daddy did bad things, didn't he? So when did this happen? Next Tuesday, says the child, and timing is of course difficult for 4-year-olds. She tries to answer something related to time, but well, the mother tries again. When did it happen? I don't know, says the child. Was it a long time ago? A long, long time ago, echoes the child. And you can see here, I think this could be very easily done in an interview as well. When the child says, I don't know, well, was it a long time ago or was it recently? That's actually better than just saying, was it a long time ago? But still, young children in particular are prone to guessing if they don't know what to answer. Anyway, this daughter does her best. A long, long time ago. Okay, a long time ago. Yeah. Wasn't it now when you were at dad's place? Oh, yes, it was now when I was at dad's place. So you can, on the transcript, it becomes really clear that the child is echoing what the mother says. For the mother, however, this was a discussion in which she felt the child had told her that her father had abused her when she was there. And I think this also shows what confirmation bias is, that if we in our head are convinced a child has been abused, we are much more likely to hear only the things that reflect that. And if we have this bias, we are inclined to pose leading questions, and children are very inclined to go along with them. So that's in a nutshell what suggestibility can look like. It can be then, suggestibility can be the incorporation of fictive things, of things that have not happened, into our own memories. So, so my memory of a situation could be distorted if someone who was also there claims something happened that didn't happen. And it seems this is a very profound human trait, that we are inclined to believe each other, especially people we like or trust, authorities, probably usually serves us really well. And for children, it's obvious that they are completely dependent on adults to understand the world and to know what to do and what to be afraid of. And when, so it's quite clear that they are very likely to trust the parents or the other adults' words about their experiences. And of course, that's how they learn about the world. They are born and have no clue about anything, and then a parent or another caregiver tells them, "No, you are cold, and that's a dog. It's not dangerous," etc. So the child has all the reason in the world to believe that. But this also means they are, well, of course, that goes on in other discussions as well. Suggestibility can also imply a child answers something that they know is not true just to be socially nice. And I think in the case of younger children, they often they probably don't monitor the fact that they are lying and that something else has gone on. They might just try to do their best in the given conversation to make the adult happy that they are talking to. Together with Mikaela Magnusson, who is a researcher who did her PhD with the University of Gothenburg, she did studies that I was participating in to a little extent, where she had a group of children interviewed about meeting a pirate, be a pirate. And as in many of these scientific studies on child testimony, half of the children didn't meet this Pia pirate, only half of them did. But all the children were interviewed about meeting Pia pirate. And as in many, many other studies, many of the children who did not meet her, who did not meet Pia pirate, they nonetheless talked about meeting the pirate, and some of them drew the pirate and the ship, etc. And after this interview, one of the small children who had been interviewed, a 5-year-old girl, told her mother when walking away that, I didn't meet that pirate at all, but I said I did because I didn't want the lady to be sad. And I think this really well shows what is going on in the head of a social and smart little child. They really want adults to be happy with them, and usually that serves them well. In the case of sex abuse allegations, for example, we also know that there are children who have lied deliberately. And I think in the case of younger children, it's really, calling it lying sounds maybe too harsh, because it's really a way just to socially to be able to handle a difficult situation. In the McMartin case, At least one of the children is known to have, as an adult, written a public letter which is called "I'm Sorry." It was published in Los Angeles Times, and he wrote that when he was a small child, he was, I think, 6 or something like that, when he was interviewed, and he said he knew all the time that he was lying, but he got so much attention and so much um, applause for saying these horrible things, and of course he had no clue of what it could lead to. I mean, he did not understand the context. So this would be another example of this sort of social version of suggestion and suggestibility. And we know that not only children but also adolescents are more susceptible to suggestion than adults. And adolescents have been there's some research on the suggestibility of adolescents also from the point of view of false confessions. So we know that there are cases in which people confess to crimes that they have not committed. And here, young people and adolescents are very much more vulnerable than more adult people. And I'll soon say why. So we know suggestion may lead to entirely false accounts. Nonetheless, children can be very competent witnesses, but they are in a vulnerable position when interacting with authorities. And as we've already been through, preschoolers in particular are vulnerable due to poorer memory and language skills and this very heightened suggestibility. But also older children and adolescents are quite vulnerable. They are in the middle of a period of confusion. Hormonal changes affect their behavior. The time of adolescence is the time when children normally should become independent and they should break away from, for example, parents. They are more likely to engage in risk taking, and they do not have developed decision-making capacities. Actually, these capacities develop quite late. So one of the reasons for which young persons are much more inclined to confess to crimes they haven't committed is that they cannot really foresee the consequences if they go along with what the police, for example, is suggesting. But another thing that can really make them vulnerable is that they appear adult. So the criminal justice system may treat them as adults and think that they understand a lot of things that they do not understand. And this is, I personally think this is really one of the big risks they are encountering. And there are quite a lot of experiences and also some findings showing that questions posed to adolescents, say 15-year-olds, in for example, court proceedings, really can be very difficult, and we should be really careful in this communication. There was a case just recently here in Finland, which I saw. I continuously supervise and train police officers doing child abuse investigations here, and there was a case with a 15-year-old who had a relationship with an 18-year-old, and that it was a consensual relationship, but her family was not happy about it, and I think that somehow then led to an investigation of it. So she was interviewed and asked about their relationship, and she said that they had had oral sex. And the police officer then asked her what she means by this. And she said, well, he put his tongue in my mouth when we were kissing. So, and we were a bit surprised, we who followed the interview, because she did seem very adult and mature, and maybe we would have expected her to know what oral sex is. But goes to show that you should always remember asking interviewees of any age what they mean with words. And sometimes children or adolescents in particular might be quite annoyed if an interviewer says, well, what do you do when you have sex? And they can say, well, what do you do? What do you do when you have sex? But then it just needs to be explained to them that people actually use this term for a variety of things. So we need to know specifically what is meant here. When children grow, their understanding of things change, and this also means that the way they look back at some memories can change. Some of you might recognize this picture. It's from the film Inside Out by Disney Pixar, which is actually a really, really good film depicting children's development and children's memory, or human memory. In this film, a girl is in puberty. She's turning 11, and she's actually sort of making a transition from the small child who has uncomplicated feelings that are happy or sad or and then or angry, and then she during this period of transition she sort of starts getting much more complex feelings, which also allows her to maybe see her previous experiences from more in a more complex light. I strongly recommend it, and the reason why I have it here is also to say that generally, of course, memory is freshware, so we need to collect memory as soon as possible. If a child is exposed to something, we are in a hurry to hear that child. But there are cases, and maybe here human trafficking is really one of the cases where time is not always only bad, because we do know that many victims of trafficking can have a very hard time understanding their own situation when they are in the middle of it, and only after some time like view it from the outside, and maybe then it's not so much a question of remembering new things as of understanding what they remember and maybe shedding light on different things. This is comparable to victims of severe violence in relationships, persons interpersonal violence. So a person can be in a violent relationship for many years, and trying to explain to themselves that the other person is really not a bad person, and they are fine. And then only when they get out of that relationship, they can sort of understand what kind of position they have been in. This also implies that the way a victim describes their experiences might change over time. And again, it's typical for our criminal justice system to view this with suspicion. But in the case of a victim of trafficking, for example, the understanding of their experiences might very well explain why their account has reflects on new things. Of course, you also have to, if an account changes dramatically, you have to consider the possibility that a person has been subject to suggestive interviewing, for example. But it's certainly not the only or the most logical even explanation. Very quickly about language development in young children. I think in the context of trafficking, most children we meet or should meet, we know they are not met as often as they should be in the Barnahus or the criminal justice process context, but most of them are likely to be older children or adolescents. But this is a question that is almost always raised. My understanding is that it's extremely rare that under 4-year-olds could be interviewed about entire experiences, and that they could give accounts that were so clear that they would be giving enough evidence to really understand the situation. Of course, if there is other evidence about abuse of a child can also be interviewed, and it's possible that the interview will add some information. But my understanding is that this is pretty internationally the case, that at the age of 4, children normally start producing sentences. Again, the individual variation is big. If the child is bilingual or has not ever gone to school, or is from a family where there has been very little talking about events, the language development will be slower. But generally, around the age of 4, children start producing sentences at the latest. And at the age of 5, many children talk fluently, which for some people is very fluently, and some people also as adults are not very fluent. So again, we are very different, of course. And we know that when small children are exposed to questions they don't understand or they don't know the answer to, they are inclined to answer yes. So this is one of the basic things about child interviewing. So there have been funny studies where children have been asked, is a jumper angrier than an elephant? And small children are very inclined to say yes. So we have to be very alert here. And I think trained investigative interviewers know this, but of course, normal parents do not. So it is always something to take into consideration that if a parent says that my child has told me, it is quite possible that the parent has asked. So you need to look into how the discussion went and collect as much information as possible about that. We know that, or actually the last decade has shown that adults, the period of adolescence is actually longer than we might have thought previously, and that it really goes on until well over 20 years. So these 15-year-olds who are already criminally responsible, they are very, very young from a maturation point of view. And in particular, the competency to assess risks and gains resulting from different actions develop until early adulthood. And this needs to be understood. We also know that children's or adolescents' cold cognition, so it's like cold decision making about facts, is much earlier mature than hot cognition, which is related to feelings and emotions and interpersonal things. So 16-year-olds might be sort of as smart as adults in terms of logical things, but usually the sort of skills in emotional issues is still developing well beyond 18 years. And there is a tendency to overestimate the capacity, the capability of adolescents. And an interesting finding is also that there is a tendency to view them as more deceitful than younger children. And I think this really can go both ways, so that when a young child says something, they are always believed, even though sometimes they actually have been indoctrinated by a parent to say something. And small children can even sometimes lie, not necessarily about a full detailed account of sexual abuse, but about some wrongdoing by an adult, for example. And of course, adolescents are not incredibly inclined to lie. So this might really be a sort of a tendency that is in the way for their perceived credibility. Just yesterday, I was training interpreters who are already registered court interpreters here in Finland, and who are now embarking on a course, a specialization course for interpreters who interpret child abuse investigative interviews. And one of these interpreters said that in the context of children who come with, for example, asylum-seeking parents, or in cases where it actually there might be reason to suspect a trafficking, these children can be very well trained by their parents on what to say if an authority asks them something. They have had reason, for example, during fleeing from another country, to be very mindful of what to say to authorities, and they might be have been giving very explicit orders to the children. So she said that as an interpreter, she feels there are situations in which the Finnish authorities are completely blind to how well these children can be instructed to tell a certain story, and that there seems to be a very strong notion that a small innocent child would never be able to lie. And it's not fully as simple as that. One of the most common misconceptions about memory is that memory would work like a video recorder, and this, of course, is not true. Another misconception that can be complicated is that I've encountered several times this thought that if someone claims they have been subject to violence repeatedly, and then when they are interviewed, they only say that, well, he used to hit me, they are not perceived as very credible, because there seems to be an underlying thought that if you've experienced something many times, you should be able to tell much more information. And paradoxically, it's not necessarily the case. We know that unique and particular episodes or experiences are often better distinguished in memory. We remember like the one time when something really strange happened, but if we are subject to something many times, we just remember the like how it generally went and lose the details. So for instance, if you were to be asked to describe every Christmas you've ever spent, if you do spend Christmases, you would quickly realize it's impossible for 99.9% of us at least. There seems to be a very small population of people who have a very strong memory for different episodes, but the absolute majority do not. So we would struggle giving details about particular Christmases. We would be able to give a lot of details on Christmases in general. And if there was one Christmas that really stood out, where someone died or was born, or we were spending it in the Caribbean, then we would be likely to remember that precise Christmas differently or perhaps better than the other ones. And this is really very relevant in the case of repeated violence or trafficking. And of course, another things that will affect memory is that if you are if you are in a situation of constant stress, then this is also hampering memory. Stress has a sort of both ways effect on memory, so that stress to a certain extent can actually improve memory. It makes us alert, it makes us reactive, but a very heavy dose of stress makes it more difficult to remember things. Maybe I could still add that if we experience very traumatic events, we know that they are actually more likely to remain with us for a longer time. Those memories can be particularly sort of strong, but nonetheless, even these kinds of memories are can be modified, and we are still subject to leading questions, for example, or to changes in memory. But it has been found that people are, in general, more likely to remember really frightening and horrible events than positive or neutral ones. Unfortunately, this might have to do with our instinct to stay alive. It probably has served us to remember life-threatening situations, so we are able to avoid them further on. This is just one of many references regarding memory, but this is a relatively recent meta-analysis of how children report single and repeated events, which may be of interest for some of you. I think I will proceed, and this is not a very long passage, but I will talk about examples of different types of cases of trafficking involving children, and then we'll have a slightly longer break. Sean, I'm just checking with you. Do you think that's okay, or do you think we should have a small break already?
No, I think that's great. We had a break. We still have some time to go, I think, before we need another break, but just another reminder to everyone who's joined that there's a Q&A feature, and we're keen to get your questions through there. So on to the next section.
Yes, thank you. So trafficking cases involving children, they can look quite different, and this is maybe one of the challenges when trying to think of ways in which to develop interview protocols for trafficking investigations. Some trafficking cases may well, we can look at the different kinds of investigations that we can be confronted with. Heuni, where I'm currently working, actually did a study on trafficking in children and young persons in Finland just quite recently, a few years ago, looking at how people working with victims have encountered, what kind of cases they have encountered. So this was a questionnaire study that was not where trafficking victims were not the subjects as due to ethical reasons, but people who work with supporting trafficking victims. And when looking at the different kinds of different kinds of trafficking cases encountered in Finland. And although this now is a study on Finnish cases, my understanding, both based on discussing with numerous other professionals and such as, for example, Rebecca O'Donnell and Nadine Finch, who have done the previous study on trafficking for the CBSS that you probably all are acquainted with by now, and also other professionals working in the field, and the research is that these are quite similar. We have cases of domestic labor, of so-called hard labor, and also sex trafficking, in which there are different categories. And I think both in the research and in at least this Heuni's report, sex trafficking seems to be the area of child trafficking which has gotten most attention. However, there are cases of, for example, both domestic labor and hard labor, where children, and in particular older children and adolescents, are implied. So it's not. Maybe there is a sort of exaggerated which we would also need research on these types of trafficking of children. But we had, as I said, we have cases of forced prostitution, commercial sexual exploitation, like systematic, and online sexual abuse. The reason why I'm adding this systematic is that within the term commercial sexual exploitation, there is a large variety of events that can be debated as whether they should be called trafficking or something else. To some extent, maybe the same is true for online sexual abuse. So I think we are still, these definitions are, to my understanding, still a bit vague and sort of developing. But just as examples from the survey by Heuni, from the study by Heuni, one case of forced prostitution, which was very widely publicized here in Finland. A middle-aged Finnish man who was actually working as a lecturer at a university met a 14-year-old girl who was having trouble at home, and they met on an internet discussion forum, and he lured the girl into living with him, making her dependent on him in many ways. And he then sexually abused her repeatedly, also by using violence, for several years, and then forced her into prostitution. She was exploited around the country and had hundreds of clients, and he was eventually sentenced to 11 years in prison. For the Finnish perspective, this is certainly a quite exceptional case, at least as far as we know. But what is not exceptional here is the sort of context of an adolescent who have hardship at home and who is desperately seeking other company, who's seeking an adult to support them. And this is, of course, a very strong vulnerability factor. During this kind of process, the girl's inclination to tell about their relationship might of course vary quite a bit. Initially, she might really be positive about this relationship, then slowly, perhaps less and less so, but on the other hand, still dependent on him, and then in the end, maybe afraid. Now, I'm not talking about this case in particular, but from the research is quite clear, as you would expect if you know the sexual abuse literature more generally, that many of these victims have self-blame, and they are ashamed, and they feel it's their own fault that they ended up in this situation. Another largely publicized case involved the recruitment of young girls and women for modeling, which is of course very appealing to many youngsters. And then this modeling offer turned out to entail the provision of erotic services, and involving severe manipulation and blackmailing and coercion and violence. And there were pictures taken, and then they were said that these would be distributed, etc. So that was another example. And there were also examples of girls originally from Western Africa and Eastern or Central Europe being forced into prostitution in Finland. Just as for some examples, and this whole report is found online, also in English, so you will have the link to that. There were also cases of sexual exploitation abroad or en route to Finland, and I think Finland here could be replaced with any other given European country. Sexual exploitation in the country of origin was very diverse, and often the perpetrator was a family member or a relative or acquaintance. Here, there's not much difference if you compare to other sex abuse cases, with the exception of online cases, maybe. Then several cases of bachabazi had been encountered in Finland among boys and young men from Afghanistan and Iran in particular. And these maybe stand out a little because otherwise sexual exploitation victims are very largely female, whether it's because they indeed are very largely female or whether it's because men and boys are even less likely to be identified as victims is, I think it's not known, but I would say that it's very likely that a much bigger proportion of the victims are indeed female, but there is also some evidence that boys have a harder time telling about sex abuse experiences for example, social reasons. And then respondents described that smugglers had forced children to have sex in exchange for transportation, or they had kept children in captivity, demanding sex as payment for the rest of the trip. So these were the forms of sexual exploitation. Then exploitation in criminal activity. Here again, runaways, like children who were placed into custody, who were not living with their parents, which already means that they do have a lot of hardships in their background to have been put into custody. These children and adolescents, I think, are much heightened risk of being victimized, as they are often without adult support, adult company, and they may seek such attention. And we also know that previous experiences of abuse, for example, may lead to a heightened risk of future risks for abuse. With the risk of sounding old-fashioned, my impression is that, at least here in Finland, and this is an impression I know the police here share, is that these children placed into custody or into institution, children's homes, etc., are in general much more likely to end up in criminal investigations, and that when looking at like a gender gap between boys and girls, the boys are much more inclined to end up with criminal activities as actors, and the girls as victims. And indeed also non-binary as victims, that they run a higher risk of being sexually offended against. Young people with substance addictions who had previously committed petty offenses and were vulnerable to pressure, they were run a much more heightened risk of being exploited in criminal activities. And also children seeking asylum could be forced into criminal activities on the way to Finland or in Finland. There were also cases of forced marriage. And again, I think these are my impression is that these are quite typical. Young people with immigrant backgrounds living in Finland, mostly girls, who are sent to the home country to be married, or couples with foreign backgrounds, often asylum seekers, have been married elsewhere and had come to Finland, and exploitation in the marriage takes place in Finland. And the third group is men with foreign backgrounds living in Finland who find or have an underage spouse from their home country and are married in the home country or in Finland. And typically in these cases, the victims are very young girls or women, and the perpetrators or the other parts are older men from the same community. Although many people in these organizations have noted that it should be acknowledged that also young men can be forced to marry and sometimes forced to marry much younger women, and they are then easily seen as perpetrators. But there can also be a question of if the actual active persons arranging or forcing the marriage can also be only the older generation and not either one of the younger partners. Okay. Okay, so now some words more specifically on interviewing children in trafficking investigations. There's not a lot of research about this topic, and there's not much known about how effective the interviewing techniques we usually recommend, like the ones I mentioned earlier, the NICHD and similar, how useful they are with trafficking victims. For example, the NICHD protocol and the cognitive interview, which is one of the most important interview methods that I think many of the others actually build upon, which is developed for witnesses who are willing to disclose, who are willing to tell about their experiences, to sort of make the most out of their memory and testimony. They work really well with willing witnesses and victims, but in the context of trafficking investigations, this is one of the issues that might be problematic. They might not be so inclined to tell about their experiences. It has been found also that the police generally lack guidance on how to respond to and how to interact with these victims, and in particular for how to engage with evasive and hostile victims. And these are behaviors that have been noted to be common, for example, in sex trafficked victims. So they might really not be very willing to tell about their experiences, and they might not interpret the police or other authorities as helping them. I previously ran a project, an EU-funded project at Heuni called SARA, which relates to violence against women in migration. It's a project that was going on in 4 different countries, in Germany, Italy, Greece, and Finland. And in all these countries, it was observed that in particular, women who were sexually trafficked were often quite traumatized by their interactions with authorities. So their perception was certainly not that authorities are there to help and support them. And of course, this affects the interaction with authorities. These were adult women, young adult women, and I think most of the victims we talk about here are adolescents. So I think the actual there's not that a clear division here between these adults and children in terms of these interaction features. There is a forthcoming systematic review of the literature on interviewing human trafficking victims, which points out that there is really an urgent need for a specialized victim-centered interviewing protocol for sex trafficking cases in general, not particularly targeted towards children, but again, I think this the core principles in general in investigative interviewing are always the same. They are the same regardless of whether we interview suspects, victims, witnesses, whether they are old age, young age, or adult. It's about creating a good report, phrasing questions wisely, knowing the evidence, and planning the interview. So, and then in this case, it's quite clear that the question of helping, supporting disclosures is very important. Also here, it's brought forward that rather little is known so far. This is a quite fresh study a few months back, that rather little is known about how investigators question minor victims of sex trafficking, and that police it's much easier, of course, to interview willing victims and witnesses than people who really do not want to be interviewed. These victims may be of sex trafficking. They may be reluctant to disclose. This also can be sort of underlined with the fact that they often are in the middle of adolescence, which is a period where the adolescents also otherwise want to break free from the adult world or from parents and other authoritative figures. And it's also been found that these adolescent victims may almost be treated as suspects by the police. So there's a kind of frustration among police officers that these people who we want to help, they just say, they seem like, they don't want to talk to us. Again, there is evidence of good interviewing for other vulnerable groups. So I think the meaningful thing to do is, of course, to use the same basic principles, to adapt this as well as we can, and then to collect more information on for example, the issue of victims who do not want to disclose. I was already talking about memory and memories for repeated events, and that they can be particularly significant in the context of trafficking. And it's known that we do develop scripts for repeated events about what usually happens, which means it's hard to separate between different similar experiences. Sonja Brubacher, who is one of the really big scientists, researchers in child interviewing, she has written about quite a bit about interviewing about repeated events, and suggests the following: that you should, when you are interviewing a victim or child about repeated events, you might want to inquire about repeated events already in the practice interview phase. I'll soon go through the phases if someone isn't familiar with the interview phases yet. But it means like a training to talk about other events before turning into the topic of substance. She also suggests using generic terms such as what usually happens when, and this is not really normally recommended in sort of when investigating individual or few cases, but also specific cases. So what happened the day when the car took you to the place, or what happened yesterday? And this has to do with the fact that when asking about specific events, memory targets that particular day and sort of leaves out everything else. But a person who has experienced repeated events might have quite a lot of memory content that is hard to place in one singular episode. So like just trying to get as much as possible broadly across the spectrum might lead to quite a lot of information in the end. You should, of course, ask if something has happened one time or more than one time, if that is not clear. This is actually true also for, so to say, basic interviews. And then labeling specific episodes. Again, this is a recommendation I would make for any interview, and particularly important with younger children, for example, because they can get lost otherwise. So really focusing on the day your uncle took you to the park. Tell me about that day. And then asking about specific episodes, the most recent, the first one, and which one do you remember best of these encounters or these people you met or whatever. So I think these are no mysteries, but these are really good to have on top of a interviewing protocol or guidance when interviewing suspected victims of trafficking, because typically these are repeated events or ongoing situations that go on for a long time. As I said, trafficking victims, this is one of the very consistent findings in the relatively scarce research so far. Trafficking victims may be highly reluctant to disclose. This has to do with skepticism towards and bad experiences of authorities, histories of abuse and neglect, bonding with the perpetrator. I'll go back to that still. dependence on the perpetrator. It might be the only one the person feels they can actually trust. Seeing themselves as active agents, or fearing that matters will only get worse if disclosing. So they are afraid what the consequences will be and afraid that the criminal justice system will not be able to support them or protect them. And there is, of course, here today we're only talking about the investigative interview, but of course it needs to be placed in a context where there is support for the victim and assurance that the victim is in fact not put into danger by disclosing, as these fears may be quite founded. So the child may be highly unwilling to tell about their situation and sometimes unaware that what they have gone through is actually a bad thing, that they have been subject to a crime. For example, as I said, there's relatively much less or very, very little, as far as I so far have found, studies on children in forced labor situations, for example, but with discussions with the police, for example, who work with these cases. These can be cases where adolescents feel it's great that they have the opportunity to earn some money, and they might be, of course, utterly unaware that they would be entitled to a certain amount of money or not to work too many hours a day, etc., etc. So it might be really difficult for them to even perceive that something wrong has happened or is happening. An understanding of one's own victimization in these cases may develop for a long time. In the case of sexual trafficking, we might have young girls who feel they have entered a relationship independently and out of their own will, and then just only quite a bit later realize that they have really been abused. And as I said, authorities may struggle to understand why these young victims are so unresponsive, and they may add pressure, so they may sort of be harsh in their interrogation, I would say, strategies, and this it may further increase the victim's lack of faith in and the bad experiences of authorities. So it really does nothing to improve that situation. And I think these are among the things that are now highly pointed out in the research literature, that this the unwillingness of victims is really one of the things we have to look at. A Swedish study showed that Swedish police interrogations with young trafficking victims were found highly suggestive. So this is, of course, something that needs to be acknowledged, and also that victims avoided certain topics like selling sex and relationships to the perpetrators, which of course are probably the most crucial topics in such an investigative interview. In an interesting study by Turkil and Tiapula, it's noted that just as an example of communication in the interview, well, if the child says something and the interviewer says, well, can you tell me what that means to you, might trigger disdain or a refusal to participate if the adolescent feels manipulated or annoyed with the tone of the interview. Interviewing techniques and language that empowers the adolescent is a more effective strategy, and this often involves acknowledging the need to be very specific. So they give us an example. I think I know what that means, but I need you to be very specific so we don't make mistakes. And again, I would repeat the example of having to ask specifically about details of sexual encounters. It is often quite heavy on the for the interviewee, for the victim, and on the other hand, often also absolutely necessary from the point of view of the investigation. So here, I think really one major step in all its simplicity that investigative interviews can do is to explain that I understand that it might feel frustrating to give so much detail, but I really need to make sure I understand you correctly. And I've seen quite a number of interviews where teenagers have been embarrassed and giggling and annoyed and whatever, and many police officers have really solved that situation really very nicely, saying that I've talked to many adolescents, and in many cases people mean surprisingly different things, and take your time. I know it's a bit, can be difficult to talk about this, but I'll be here with you. It's okay. And another thing I will revert to at the end of this presentation is that I also think that empowering the adolescent also means that we have to accept if a person does not want to tell about certain things, and we have to give that decision and choice to the victims. No victim can or should be forced or manipulated. They have already been forced and manipulated if they are victims of trafficking, and we can't do that in the criminal investigation. So much better is really to focus on the interaction, make it as good as possible, and tell them that I will not, of course, force you to tell about things that you don't want to talk about, but I will help you as much as I can, and I really, we have all the time that you want to go through these things. Young victims of trafficking, I'm writing young, I'm adolescents, teenagers, probably also younger children, but my impression is that this is the most, quantitatively the most likely group. They often have cumulative changes, and they may be quite far from what is known as the perfect victim, and maybe from what is expected by police officers. And in particular, adolescents, and I suspect in particular boys engaging in criminal activities under the influence of someone else may be treated solely as perpetrators. So we might be too blind to the fact that they actually might have been manipulated or forced to do criminal activities. I was myself an expert in a case rather recently in Finland, which I found rather eye-opening, because it was a case where there was a young boy who was living with his both parents. This was a Finnish family, but they had moved from another country rather recently to Finland, and they did not have any extended family where they lived, and apparently not a very strong social network, at least him. He did go to school, and he did do well in school. And when he had just turned 15, which also in Finland is the age of criminal responsibility, it was discovered that his parents were selling drugs. And it also became evident that he had participated in this. He had, on request of his father, he had helped in taking some packages to some customers and taking back some money, or like working as a mailman. And in the district court decision, he was sentenced as a criminal himself. And then before the appeal court, his lawyer was in contact with me and said that, well, he doesn't know these cases very well, but he thinks it's a bit odd that this boy whose parents sort of had made him engage in this activity, and who was so young, he was younger than 15 when these things started, that he would be seen as a criminal. And I, of course, agreed. But this, to my knowledge, this is really a very unique case in Finland. We did not find any other similar cases, but in the appeal court, I did argue that a child in this position does really not have a possibility, well, at least not a considerable possibility to act sort of independently. A child is, by definition, depending on his parents until they are 18 years, until they are adults. And if the parents are putting the child in danger, as I think this arguably is the case, then society has the responsibility to protect that child. And in this case, that was not the case. So this boy had, among other things, started using some drugs himself, with the consequence that he was then later on struggling in school, although he had been doing very well initially. So in the appeal court, in the end, he was not then sentenced. But apparently there had been an interesting discussion, and I think from a trafficking point of view, you could I'm not a lawyer, so it's not my case to take that decision. But from a psychological point of view, I would say that the same kind of taking control or manipulating someone into doing something is very strongly present here. The boy is now, he was then moved, he now lives somewhere else and is doing really fine in school, last I heard. So it's going okay for him, as I understood. Within the interview, concretely, those of you who have done interview training will know this. Any good interview has to start with a pre-interview planning and preparation, and there the child's background is crucial to understand. And in the case of trafficking, this is also a place to consider cumulative traumatic experiences, which might really have a large effect. Whether the suspected perpetrator is the adult that the child really is dependent on. Of course, that can change very much the child's possibility to tell things about that adult. In some cases, in cases of sexual online abuse, there might be video material, photo material depicting the child, and it's important to know whether the child knows of this material or not, if it's possible to find out. The cultural background needs to be considered, and I think we have to move in the direction where I think individual police officers and investigative interviewers or judges for that matter cannot be experts on every culture in the world. But if we know that we will have a child from a certain cultural background, we might do well in at least familiarizing ourselves to some extent, looking at what there is in terms of literature. And another thing is if the child will be interviewed using interpretation, to really take the time to plan ahead. And although we'll go back to interpretation in a moment, but I think talking with the interpreter prior to the interview might also give important clues to cultural sensitivities. Although, of course, an interpreter is an expert in interpreting and should not be put in a position where they are asked to do completely different tasks. But many of these cultural sensitivities can be visible in language, in expression. So already that can open up quite a lot of, or can decrease risks for miscommunication. Then in the interview, I think any good interview has an introduction where you tell the interviewee where they are, why they are there, and of course this again will to some extent depend on the context, on the country, on the legislation, what needs to be told to interviewees in different legal positions. But of course, as a general rule in child interviews, it should always be child friendly and on a level that the child can understand. And unfortunately, I think there are many struggles here. I think, for example, in asylum interviews, not only to children, but to human beings in general, the way people's responsibilities are described to them are such that I am quite certain many people do not understand them. And since police officers, who in many countries are the ones who do all child interviews, are not particularly trained in child development, I think they really need help in planning how to describe the interview and the roles in a child-friendly way. So I think here we have to make sure also within the different countries, within the different legislations, that we think of ways to say the things we have to say according to legislation in a way that is child-friendly. Ground rules, that's the responsibilities of a witness, for example. There in many jurisdictions, it's specifically said that, for example, that you are not forced, you can choose whether you want to tell me things or not. You don't have to say things if you don't like to, but you should not lie. Would you promise that you won't be lying, or can we decide that you won't lie, etc.? And again, here, this also needs to be considered from a cultural point of view. What is a culturally sensitive way of describing or deciding on these tasks. Then child interviews are followed by a practice interview, which is also called episodic memory training. I like the practice interview because it says what it's about. It's about training. And here the child is familiarized with the way of communicating in the interview. And it's also a way of getting an idea of this particular individual's way of talking, of communicating. I sometimes encounter the false idea by police officers that this is something that you do only with small children. And I completely disagree. I think I would certainly do it with adults if I were a police officer, not necessarily saying that now we will rehearse how good you can tell me things and tell me about your birthday party, but just take any situation and try to get the person talking about that. And I've seen numerous interviews with old adolescents, with teenagers, where police officers have said that, okay, so now we will practice a little bit the way in which I want you to tell me things, or the way in which this interview works. So I'm going to ask you about whatever, your day yesterday, or your recent celebration, or your trip, one-day trip somewhere. And I would like for you to describe everything you remember to me as well as you can. And of course, you have to think, you can take a very big event if you don't want to spend the whole day during the practice interview, but something that the child or the adolescent is inclined to remember and can be asked about. And I've seen so many interviews where the beginning is a bit sort of how would I say, the interviewee is struggling, but when sort of provided support to continue, they get the grip of it and start telling in many details about some experience. And I think it's been demonstrated in research, but I think you can, I've been watching so many child interviews, I think you can really see it in the interviews that a child who has been, where there has been a proper practice interview, they are really more inclined to talk more also when they are going into the topic of abuse. And this is important because we know, of course, there are obstacles to talking about abusive experiences or as trafficking, but even if the child or the interviewee would be okay with talking about those things, for many people already talking in general in this kind of investigative interview setting is making them nervous, and it's difficult, how do I talk to this person, and I've never been in this kind of situation before. So really just accustoming the person with the interview, I think, is incredibly important. There are cases, of course, in which the interviewee is so uninclined to be responsive that it's very hard to get into a communication with them. And I would stress that you should, in most cases, just to try to pick another topic, have a break, or let them have a coffee or whatever, and then continue, rather than then marching too quickly into the actual topic. There are exceptions. There are some cases where an adolescent knows very well why they have come to the police, and they really are sort of anxious to get to the topic, to talk about it. And then, of course, you have to respect that and listen to them and let them talk. So you won't be forcing them by beating them in the head with the practice interview if they are willing to talk about the actual experiences immediately. But this is the golden rule, and as interviewing always, you have to be flexible. In the substantive phase, everyone who's been in trainings know why I have this picture here. You start with the invitations, with the open-ended questions. Tell me everything you remember. Tell me about that. Tell me. And then you go into queued invitations. Tell me more about the man who took you there, and tell me more about your uncle's car or what happened there. And then more focused questions only when you have exhausted all the possible information through open-ended prompts. And as late as possible, these yes and no questions. That's, again, the general rule. And of course, in all living interviews, there may be some more specific questions earlier on, but they should in as much as possible, come as late as possible. And then the closure, and I won't be talking today about the closure. I think that there, of course, we come into the question of the collaboration with other authorities, making sure that the child is okay, that they get support, psychosocial support, protection, etc. But we're focusing now on the investigative interview today, although everything that happens after and before and around that is, of course, also really important for the well-being of the child. Among the most crucial things here are the role of rapport and support. And I think this is, of course, again, regardless of age, regardless of what we are investigating or whatever we are interviewing a person about, meaningful rapport is really known to enhance the communication and help children cope with anxiety and negative emotions. It cannot be stressed enough. And the variation seems to be very big. There is, of course, just inter-individual variation. Some people are better with people in general than others, but to some extent, you can learn to improve these skills. And I think it all begins with an understanding that the person in front of you can have very valid reasons to behave like they are, and it goes for, I think, police officers who interrogate suspects that are known to have committed terrible crimes. If they start with the idea that we have to nail this bastard, they are much less inclined to get information than if they start with the thought that this person has made a terrible crime and we need to understand what has happened. In one investigative interview where a police officer interviewed a young adolescent boy who had committed some not so serious crime, but still he was in a criminal investigation as a suspect. The police started by saying she had met him before, apparently. She said, "Okay, tell me, how come we are here in this situation?" And that was sort of a way of saying that I'm here with you, I'm in a way on your side, and now just tell me, how did this come to be? And with him it worked very well. I think it was a very nice way, but of course there is no way that will work with every person. This is really a question of interpersonal communication, but really trying to see mentalizing the other person's situation will likely help. It is important to know the NICHD protocol, as you would know, most of you, has been revised a few years ago to incorporate strategies to provide support for the child and to create rapport. This is incredibly important, and there are studies showing that an increased focus on support and rapport actually helps children disclose, for example, in cases where we know that they have been abused, that these strategies really might be helpful. On the other hand, it's important to note that as these strategies are now written in the English NICHD protocol, they cannot necessarily be translated verbatim. We would need really to have when translating these types of things, we really have to have a profound understanding of what is the meaning of these sentences, what is the point of them, what are we trying to do with them, and what is the appropriate way of doing that in a given cultural context and in a given language. And I think especially when it comes to posing open-ended or closed questions, those seem to be relatively similar in different languages. But when we come to these social cues, like how do you make someone at ease, I personally think that the NICHD protocol has there you have to have a cultural sensitive modification, because, for example, there are examples of ways of sort of giving support, like using the child's name repeatedly. So, Julia, tell me, Julia, how is it, Julia? I think this works really well in an Anglo-Saxon culture. In Finland, I think it would be very odd. And in some cultures, it might be even offensive if your name is used. It might be almost perceived as an attack. Another thing is asking the interviewer to look you in the eyes. This is also something that is not at all appropriate in all cultures. showing considerable interest in the child, saying, I really, really want to get to know you better. Again, in some cultures, including my own, it would be perceived as odd by at least adolescents. Or it might be, let's say so. This is my interpretation. And there's very, very scarce research, to my knowledge, on this. There is one study by Renate Wolbert and Jana Otsipka and Dr. Anna Tam, who looked at a German sample where they looked at how these different strategies are perceived, and it wasn't particularly, the focus wasn't particularly on the cultural differences, but they did bring it up, and it was clear that in the German context, some of these strategies worked really well, but others were not well placed in that context. So this is something I would advise you to think of when you use the revised protocol, and I am absolutely recommending everyone to use the NICHD revised protocol. It's really important to focus on the report, on the support in the interview, but be mindful that in different cultures, these ways of supporting someone socially can take different forms. And here again, I think collaborating with interpreters is one of the clues, one of the most feasible ways to work around this problem, to have a discussion with the interviewer, with the interpreters beforehand, explaining to them that here, if I say, can I help you telling this to me, or look me in the eyes, or whatever, what I really want to do is to make it easier for the child, or show the child that I support them. What is it? Do you have what would be an appropriate way in your language to say things to support the child, for example? So that could be a way of finding things that work. It's also, I think, important to note that whereas for the evidence, it's really crucial that no open-ended question is translated into a closed one. With these social cues, maybe it's not the same kind of exactness. Here, it's more important to understand what we try to achieve with these questions. So for an interpreter to be able to interpret this in a meaningful way, they need to understand why these phases are as they are, why these questions are posed. I already had a very critical example from our Finnish asylum interviews. So just to be balanced, I also have one that I think is very nice. A clearly traumatized asylum seeker was interviewed, and the interviewer said that you don't have to tell us more than you can manage. We understand that you are ill and that you're having a hard time speaking of these things. You can relax, everything is fine. We are here for you to look into your story, and you can tell us as much as you can. And then later on, thank you for telling us the difficult parts of your story. I think it got, in an asylum interview, it doesn't get much nicer than this. This is a clear indication that we are on your side and we just want you to tell us. We know it's difficult. So this serves as a good example. As I said, and I think this has to be emphasized, no child should be forced or heavily manipulated to tell. And I know how strong there might be very, very strong, how would you say, if there's a big concern about the child, there are strong forces at play. You really want to make sure that the child is not victimized, or if there's a strong suspicion, you really want to be able to make sure the child is protected. And you may have a child in front of you who says that I don't want to talk about it, or clearly seems to be not telling the truth. Here, I think we would all run a risk of becoming suggestive and becoming too like really trying to get the child to tell in ways that may be problematic. It is human. So I think this has to be like a golden rule that is always on the top of our mind, that we can provide a possibility for these victims to tell about their experiences, but we should not and shall not force them. And I think heavy manipulation, like really stressing that it would be so important and I would be so glad if you told me. Those are approaching a kind of force. So if the child does not want to address the substantive issue, you have to respect it. Or I would feel I would have to respect it. I saw a really nice interview where a police officer who's now specializing or specialized in investigative trafficking cases. She has previously worked very much with online abuse victims. And she did a very, very good interview where a teenage girl had been uh, identified that she was one of many victims of an adult man some years earlier, and she had never told about it. She had not disclosed, and we know from research that if victims disclose to someone before the investigative interview, they are quite likely to disclose in the interview. But these victims who do not disclose are more complicated, naturally, because the child has already once made the decision to tell. In this case, the child, this adolescent girl, she had not told anyone, and she was not aware before she came to the police what the topic was, and she was incredibly uninclined to tell. She was really in opposition, swearing and telling the police officer off and looking down and hiding under her cap. And she was like, immediately when she came into the room, she said, "I'm not going to say anything." And then the police officer said, "Yeah, I'll respect that. I won't force you to tell me anything. That you have the right to decide if you want to talk to me or not. But is it okay if I go through what the purpose of this interview is?" And the girl sort of nodded, and the police went on and said, "So this and this is the situation, and I understand that you don't want to." That you might not want to talk, but is it okay if I pose a question and you just decide then if you want to answer? And the child was like, mm. And then she asked, and the child responded. Very few words initially, but slowly but surely she sort of raised her head and started talking in longer and longer sentences. And I think no way that this would have worked with an approach where the interviewer would have said, "It's really important that you tell me." But this approach, where it was really clear that it was up to the child herself if she wanted to tell or not, this was working fantastically here. It won't always work, but I think it's the most ethical way to go about it. And if the child clearly doesn't want to talk, maybe one thing to do is to say that, "Okay, I appreciate that you don't want to talk about these things. Would it be possible if we met again next week? And I'll just give you some more information, or I this and this is the thing that we're investigating. And if you during this week, if you decide that there are things you want to tell me, then we can talk about it then. And but you won't be forced also next week to talk about this." Or then within the interview, talk about other things, go get a coffee or whatever, talk about completely unrelated things, really try to get some kind of contact, talk about anything. That's always the first step. Then if the child leaves without having talked, provide them with contact information saying, "This is where you can be, this is where you can contact me," or whoever. In the literature, it's also been noted that for children suspected of trafficking, for children in vulnerable positions, the idea that they would call a given police officer between 9 and 5, it's going to exclude many attempts to contact, because in many cases these children might be sleeping during the day and awakened during the night, or they might be most lonely during the evenings. And the risk is, of course, that if they are feeling lonely in the evening and there is no reliable adult to turn to, then they will turn to unreliable adults. So I think this is another thing we have to think of. Do we have possibilities to have contact during all hours of the day and the night for these children? It's also been noted that for some children and adolescents nowadays, it's much more. It can be easier for them to write a text or record a video voice message telling about their experiences. And certainly we cannot recommend, I mean, this cannot be, an investigative interview cannot be conducted this way, but perhaps there are some possibilities to tell the child that if something comes to your mind before we meet next week, you can also text me on this phone. And this could be used maybe then as an starter for the discussion. Again, here there's a lack of research. There might be legal issues to think about, so I wouldn't recommend you go and do it right now just like that. But I think for the future we have to think about what are the ways in which youth are most comfortable in communicating, and our very rigid criminal justice system we have to look at how we can make it as possible for these young victims. In some child interviews already today, children actually write things that they don't want to express verbally. I had one quite little girl who had been sexually abused and who could not bring herself to say that the man had touched her genitals. And it was clear she talked about everything until that, everything after that, and she said that she struggled to say the word name of the genitals. So at some point I asked her if she knew how to write, and she wrote down on a small piece of paper, and then I read it aloud, and then we continued discussing, and then she could talk about it. So sometimes it can be maybe done even within the interview. And I do know cases where children have disclosed to their parents when they have been in the same apartment, but through WhatsApp or some other text message. It can be easier to talk about difficult things that way for adolescents. So this is maybe more things we have to think of for the future. I'll rather soon we'll have the last small break for today. But themes to explore in the interview, when we talk about trafficking, it is important to look at issues such as control, freedom. Who are your friends? Who can you spend your time with? Where do you go if you go outside the home? Means of contacting. For example, a perpetrator may restrict the child's use of phone, social media, or they may be controlling how the child uses those so that they are not actually free to use them how they want to. So these could be rather concretely talked about, not through, is somebody forcing you to not do this or that, but rather, how is it, what do you do on your phone, and who do you contact, and which means do you usually contact them? Bank cards, money, do they have money on their own? How do they have that money? Of course, if we have suspicions of labor exploitation, then salaries, payments, how are you paid, in which way, how often, how much money, and working hours, etc. Also, these can be issues that are very difficult for people to know. For example, the question of working hours. Again, here I think we have assumptions that people would know if they work 7 or 9 hours a day. But if you work without a clock, most of us have no idea. Our memory is really not a time machine. It's not developed to sort of put time labels on our experiences, and time is a very murky thing to estimate. We all know that when something is when we're having, meeting our loved ones, the time flies by too quickly. But when we are waiting for the dentist, so it takes forever or whatever, nice things tend to feel like they go too quickly by, etc. Daily routines are important to ask about. And again, especially in the case of, for example, exploitation that the children are not themselves aware of, where like there is massive control of the child's behavior, they might not respond. They might not say that somebody is controlling them. This might, however, become apparent when they say that they cannot go anywhere after school. The only place they can go is if they go with their father or brother or whatever, and their phone is taken away when they come home and they have no access to the internet. But if they don't themselves feel it's a problem, or then they would maybe not be coming forward on this. Circumstances of living, room of one's own, sanitary food, and really relationship to X. Timelines. The first time, the last time we already talked about this. When this, for example, recruitment or relationship with the abuser started, time before, time after, and concrete things rather where and with whom than when, for example. As I said, we don't memorize times very well, or really not at all, but we do memorize where we have been and with whom to a much better extent. And actually, when you think about it, when you think about your previous experiences and you try to estimate when a certain thing has happened, you typically, most of us at least, typically reason around facts. We remember we lived in that house, that therefore it has to have been that time, or this was before the children were born, so that must have been before this and this year. This is highly typical, and again, also this can be culturally sensitive. Different cultures have different things that are important when we estimate timing of events. I'm now going to talk a little bit about online sexual abuse, and then as one of the forms of sex trafficking. Just first of all, for those who have not seen this interesting research, Malin Juleby and her colleagues have at the University of Gothenburg have done studies on experiences of online sexual abuse, and also looked into court verdicts in Sweden on how courts reason about these sex abuse experiences. And it seems that there is an unfortunate assumption that online sexual abuse would, in principle or in general, be less harmful than offline sexual abuse. And it probably has to do with the fact that people think that if someone else is in the room with the child, there's a real risk of violence, which is true, of course. But then again, in the online sexual abuse cases, at their worst, the perpetrator can really force children to do very terrible things to themselves, including physically harmful things, forceful penetration, for example. And they have the added trauma, if you want, of the children knowing that this material exists and may be seen by anyone. And in addition to this, children may feel even more guilt and shame of having taken part in these activities. I think it's hard for the more adult generation who have not grown up with the online world to appreciate how normal online life is for the younger generations, and how real the relationships there are, and how important it is what happens there. So there might be that these court persons in Sweden in this study also struggle because of the fact that this has not been part of their childhood or youth. And I would say, of course, also that both online and offline sexual abuse can come from very not so grave things like someone sending a dick pic to a child that might be annoying, but for many teenagers, something that they can sort of shrug off with again, one of these irritating things. And it can go until really terrible sexual abuse. And of course, such is the case also in offline cases. So there's this is a very broad category of issues. But what is important is that in comparison to other forms of sexual abuse, where there often is not evidence for the abuse, here there often is evidence. And quite in many cases, the whole investigation starts with the police getting information, photographs, videos, chat logs, identifying a certain child, and then only initiating an investigation. So the child may not have said anything to anyone about this. Some children may not even think that they have been abused. They may think they have had a relationship with the same age peer and have no idea that the other person was much older. Or they may have exchanged photos with someone and forgotten about it. It may be something that they think is nothing. Or they may have been really afraid and scared and forced by the perpetrator to send more and more pictures, or and told that otherwise they will harm their family or do other things. But the point of departure often is that there is evidence for the abuse, and this needs to be then taken into account in the interviewing strategies. And these cases may come, as the case I mentioned earlier, with a long delay. And in these cases, children may really realistically struggle to remember. This again might be a thing where adults think that if a child, when they were 13, has been has for example sent a nude picture to an adult, that this would be something they would always remember very clearly. It is quite possible, if this is the only time and the first time, it's quite possible and probable indeed that the child would remember the situation itself. But the details, of course, go lost after some time, especially if this has not been talked about. In some cases, children have had numerous such interactions and really have no clue which one is now being talked about. So it might be very true that they struggle to remember. It might not always be that they are just not wanting to disclose. And particularly, of course, in less severe cases. The more severe cases, the less likely it is that the children would not remember in general. These current interviewing guidelines are not in all aspects well adjusted to online cases, particularly from the point of view of how we should address evidence. And especially in the case where the child may be unaware that there are pictures and videos of themselves. And in some cases, children can really be traumatized by the investigation itself when they find out that there are nude videos, pictures of them around the internet that they have not known. So the perpetrator may have pretended to be a same age peer, saying, "No, I'm not taking photos. It's like a live exchange," and then they have recorded everything. So this might be extremely uncomfortable for the child, and it might be very uncomfortable to know that police officers and judges are watching that material. And again, here I think we really have to think within our criminal justice system on how to do these processes as non-traumatizing as possible for the children. Then another thing is that there is a lot of judicial information that should be asked, but it's not always the case that child interviewers are aware of all these issues. For example, if I were to interview a victim of online sexual abuse, I really would need to to update myself on the most common social media for that adolescents are on, and how they communicate and what they what kind of interactions they engage in, because otherwise it'll be hard to pose the right questions, and then you might lack information that is really crucial in the investigation. We had a court case in Finland a few years ago where it was around in the news that someone had to explain very in a detailed way for the judges what Twitter is and how you put things on Twitter. Well, it's good that they explained it, but really we need this information on how social media works and what the children's surroundings there are to be able to do these investigations well. So we are now working actually with and this is also connected to another CBSS project, a Promise project, where we are working on a modification of the NICHD for online cases. And it's not a major modification in any way. It's actually just an attempt to give examples of how you can introduce the evidence in a child-friendly way, and how you can ask about online activities in an informed way. And we have been struggling to think of ways in which to test this. We have already a ready version of this protocol. I have presented it in a earlier on in a presentation, and we have struggled to think about how we could test this sort of in a laboratory way, and we have come to the conclusion that it's really difficult to make a setting that would be in any way realistic compared to real cases. So it might be that we just have to forget about a laboratory test and just proceed to collecting information on how this interview guide is used in real field cases, and we know that police officers in Finland are already to some extent using this, so we hope to be able to do this assessment as pretty soon. And again, these are of course cases that are overlapping with trafficking. Many of them are trafficking cases. Okay, dear participants, 50 more minutes. I noticed that people are nice enough to remain online, although this is quite a long session. But let's see now. We are here. So I'm just quickly going to say something about this topic of psychological coercion and control, which is, I think, as I said earlier, really crucial to recognize in the context of trafficking. And it's been written about for quite some time already, but I think in terms of how to actually investigate this issue, there is not that much to go on. Psychological coercion has been compared to slavery without chains, invisible chains. And in Finland during the last years, we've had several very, very much talked about media cases where, for example, one very, very much attention provoking article in our main newspaper was about the investigation of sexual trafficking. And here are just some examples that from the police interview the victim talked about, and or within the material of the case, it was evident that the police asked questions such like, did he keep you behind bars? Were you locked in a room? Did they force you? Tell us. You have to understand, we can't keep him in custody if he didn't force you. And this is maybe showing the frustration of the police officers, and on the other hand, attempts that are of course very, very not likely to succeed in giving the victim a chance to explain how come she felt she couldn't do anything else than what the perpetrator wanted her to do. And I think here maybe if these police officers had been more aware that people really can be controlled by psychological means, they might not have been this rushed to ask for physical force. But I think we still have some way to go here for the criminal justice system to fully understand the issue of psychological coercion and control. It's known that when this kind of coercion is used, it can be used through threats of violence, but it doesn't necessarily have to come with violence, and not even with real threats. It can be more creating a kind of atmosphere of, if you don't go along, then ... so that there's an expectation that something terrible will happen. And also in a relationship where a perpetrator constantly criticizes the victim and abuse them verbally, humiliate them, threat them, etc., the person's agency can be broken down to really, so that they start distrusting themselves, their own thoughts, their own reasoning, their own possibility to take care of themselves without the perpetrator. And psychological coercion, however, can also be done through positive interaction. So we know that some of these sexual trafficking cases, for example, start by the perpetrator pretending to be a partner or a friend or a role model or even a replacing parent, like the adult person who is a stable person for the young who is challenged, and that slowly these can then turn into abusive relationships, and it might be hard for the victim to realize it, especially if the perpetrator is good at psychologically manipulating them into think that this is what they want themselves. There are situations that have sometimes been compared to trafficking, for example, with sects that make take in like groom young members and make them slowly realize that their own background families have been evil all along, and sort of leave their own background families and start to sort of manipulating them into thinking that all the other people in their lives have actually been bad for them. This is another form of psychological manipulation, I think very closely related to these trafficking issues. We also know that previous vulnerability renders victims much more vulnerable to this, and this kind of positive, like if a perpetrator also engages in positive interaction with a victim who has had very little of that, even that might be better than any interaction they have had in their lives, and this might create quite a lot of love and solidarity towards the perpetrator. And I did read in some of the more recent articles that what we should strive to do when helping these trafficking victims is really to help them create healthy relationships, which is certainly easier said than done if you have a history of trauma and not being able to trust anyone for real. But we also know for people that we fear the unknown, and the unknown may be more frightening than the devil that is known. So if a person is in a very problematic relationship, it might still feel more safe than going out there and being all alone. And here again comes, of course, the issue of the importance of this social support for victims outside of the strict interview setting. One term that is also good to know in this context is what is referred to as trauma bonding, which is basically what I just said, that a person who has had problematic relationships, who has not had reliable persons in their life, are more inclined to sort of bond really strongly to people who also then may abuse them. It might be in a way a survival instinct as well. Many of you would probably remember the term Stockholm syndrome, which it's partly wrongly used maybe in some discussions, but it has been used to describe a situation where a hostage person taken hostage develops positive emotions for the one who is keeping them hostage, and this could very well be explained by, first of all, by an instinct to try to survive. If you are hostage and there's only one person who is taking care of you, you are completely dependent on that person, and the most wise thing to do is probably to act in a way that this person wants you to stay alive, and a positive interaction often reinforces itself and can lead to positive interaction both ways. And also, if you're alone with a person and have no social interaction with anyone else, the little positive interaction you get can become really, really important and meaningful. So there can be like very complex and complicated relationships. Features of trauma bonding include, there's a rather recent review article listed down there. They include an imbalance of power, the perpetrator using alternately positive and negative interactions, and then this victim's gratitude for the positive interaction and inclination to self-blame themselves for the negative, and also the victim sort of assuming the perspective of the perpetrator, watching themselves and their interaction with the eyes of the perpetrator. And again, I think this is probably familiar to those of you who have worked with violence within close relationships. For example, a woman feeling that her man was really a good man all along, but of course he would get mad at her because she behaves this and that way, etc., etc. That's another form of trauma bonding and psychological control. As mentioned, isolating the victim in sect recruitment or similar situations, it's a very efficient way of getting hold of a person. People are dependent on social interactions, and they will take what they have If they have just one, then that's better than nothing. And of course, in the case, for example, of victims from other countries, where they, for example, are taken into the country for sexual trafficking or labor trafficking, if their only contact is the person who traffics them from their own country, on who they are dependent, who on the other hand also is the only one maybe understanding where they come from, their language, etc., it might be a very hard time to decide to perceive that person as a perpetrator of something evil. It might be easier also to just think that this is probably a person who does what they think is best for me. And here we know that in many cases of intimate partner violence, this kind of psychological defense can be quite strong. In the interview, again, as much information as possible about everyday life, typical days. I already talked a bit about this. When talking about persons, tell me about him. How did you meet? What are the positive things about him? What are the negative things? What you like, not like, not in an incredibly judgmental way. Friends and family are important issues. Is there someone you can trust? If there are problems, who do you tell? Living conditions, things you need to do, things you cannot do. What do you think would have happened if you had gone out, for example? What did you want to do if you wanted to, well, what did you do if you wanted to buy something, or any other example? Describe what a good day was like, and good, bad situations, experiences. Linda Cordisco-Steele, who is familiar to some of you and at least the interpreters I just had when we had a pause discussion, has also done a sort of slight adaptation of the NCAC interview protocol for the purpose of trafficking situations, which can be found on the link provided there. And it's very similar, I noticed, very similar issues to, for example, what the police in Finland who do trafficking investigations have long talked about. So where do you live, with whom, how do you like it, where do you go if you go away, where did you live before, how come you moved, where did you grow up, with whom, are you still in contact with them, etc. This is now a combination of my own thoughts and Linda's writings and some other input. And of course, these do depend based on what kind of suspicion we have, of course. As you see, it's not very specific in terms of, there's not a clear, completely different protocol in terms of this is what you need to do in trafficking investigations. It's more like a mindset acknowledging some of the major vulnerabilities, some of the major memory issues, some of the major, and we'll come to that now, cultural issues. When we talk about persons from originating from other countries and cultures, these cultural aspects are incredibly important. And my own work, as I said, I've been doing quite a bit of research lately on asylum procedures, and the interest for that was actually initiated when I was asked to look at a case where a young boy from Afghanistan had applied for asylum in Finland. This was in 2015, when all over Europe there was a much higher number of asylum applicants suddenly, and severe problems in how these asylum applications were handled were noted. So in this case, I told immediately that I am no expert in asylum cases, but that if they want me to look at the interview, I can of course do that. So I did, and just briefly, this boy was interviewed using closed questions. There's very little open-ended questions, and these questions demonstrated significant doubts about his veracity. So he was constantly being communicated that he wasn't believed. In the decision, there was, which was negative, they claimed that there were several contradictions in his account. And one of these contradictions was that he was first saying that something happened in the afternoon, and later on that it happened in the night. And he actually did try to provide a reasonable explanation for this. He said that in our language, we talk about afternoon until night falls. But yet in the first decision he got, this was referred to as a major discrepancy and a reason for which he was not believable. He also told that he had been subject to sexual violence, and on another instance that he had been subject to physical violence. And in the decision, for some reason, they felt that these things were not possible at the same time. But in fact, he was talking about two different occasions, and they were not in any way mutually exclusive. So there really seemed to be a tendency to trying to see anything as unbelievable in his account. And then there were some things that remained rather unclear, which, looking at the interview, seemed to have much more to do with the very poor questioning than the boy's answers. Luckily, this decision was then later overturned, so these problems were duly noted. For me, this was, however, a wake-up call, because I had been working for such a long time with child investigative interviews. And at that time, already in Finland, we had for many years a mandatory one-year training for child interviewers, and very clear guidance in how you have to do these interviews. And this was so far away from that. This was so much worse in terms of quality. And I was struck by the fact that in the child abuse investigations we have, most of them are dealing with very, very mild forms of violence, if you excuse that expression, but with hair pulling or like very sort of minor events. Of course, the scale is all over the place. There are also very severe cases, but we have a very low threshold in Finland for reporting to the police. And yet for these children, which is of course good, we really want to have the best possible interview. And in these cases, which is about I think death and life for a lonely asylum seeking minor, there was really no quality assurance. So this sparked the interest in asylum interviews, and there is quite a lot of interesting research from the last years. Well, quite a lot is much to say, but there is some very interesting research, and some of it is highly relevant, I think, for the trafficking context. One PhD which was made in the Netherlands some years ago by Tanja van Veldhuizen looked at how asylum seekers were interviewed about where they came from. And she noted that there were quite a lot of assumptions of what they should remember, and that these assumptions did not necessarily correspond with what people really can be expected to remember. So one thing, for example, that people could be asked was to describe the currency of their country, which was felt apparently that this is something people should be able to do. And intuitively, it might feel that, yeah, we would all be able to describe our currency. But if you think about it, if you were to describe, I don't know, in Sweden, a certain, I don't know, 100 krona bill, it's possible that some would struggle. I've tried with the euro, the 20 euro bill in many of my trainings, and almost always there is not one who remembers what the image on it is. Everyone remembers the color almost. And some people confuse it to older Finnish bills, but mostly it's like blank. People really, they've seen that bill hundreds of times. They would be able to recognize it, of course, also from other similar bills, but really remembering recalling what it looks like is harder than you think. And Tanja van Veldhuizen found similar problems with these assumptions. And in Åbo Academy, we have a large research project looking at these things. So those of you who are interested in that can have a look. Jenny Skrivars and Hedda Jatselim are doing their PhDs, among other things, on how sexual identity is assessed. We know that many applicants apply because they claim that they are homosexual, which would be then perhaps an aspect that would grant them asylum. So the authorities try to establish whether they are credible or not when claiming that they are homosexual. And this is an area where we really do not have very much to go on in terms of research, and it does seem that these evaluations are rather intuitive and lean on stereotypical ideas that, especially when we think about an international context where we have people from countries where homosexuality may be completely taboo, not talked about at all, or even charged with death penalty, it's not surprising that it may be hard to describe. So I think this research is really quite informative in all the cases, all the legal cases where we have cultural differences. Already many years ago, actually inspired by the case I mentioned, I did a short article, which is found also in English, about minor asylum seekers. So there's also some of what we've been going through today, but it's found online as well, and you will have the link to that article as well. Some years ago, an opinion was published in Nature entitled "Most People Are Not Weird," which is a funny title, and it means that most people are not Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic, or from such countries. The point of this article is that most of the science of human behavior is conducted in Western countries, the bulk of it in the US and in Anglo-Saxon countries. Very much of it is actually conducted on university students, because when researchers try to do experiments, that's the easiest target group to get. And these American, English, and to some extent other Western European, largely university student groups do not necessarily represent all of the world. Of course, there is research on behavior also in many other countries, but looking at the whole picture, the fair majority is from the US and a few other Western countries. And for long, it's sort of been just, this has not been emphasized, or this has not been actually noticed. So we have just had these assumptions that psychology research shows that people work this way, and then we've thought, okay, that's it. And now the question is, which things are such that are common for human beings generally, and which things are cultural bound? And it's quite clear that a smile is a smile in every culture around the world. In every country around the world, people are inclined to remember traumatic things and care for their children, and etc. But there are certainly also aspects, as already mentioned with memory, for example, that are very much influenced by culture, by how we communicate. And of course, this is also changing. Our world is now getting more and more globalized. Young people all over the world are much more seeing the same kind of media than what was the case 30 years ago. So we're in a constant change also in this respect. But it's clear that our memory is culture dependent, and we really need to understand that in legal processes as well. In our processes, what we largely are dealing with are autobiographical memories, so memories of our own past experiences. And as already mentioned, it's been found in research that the way in which children are communicated with influences how they communicate and understand such experiences. What we are likely to remember depends on the context, on our family, education, cultural background, emotional state, the passing of time, social interaction, and these need to be considered both when interviewing and when assessing accounts. And for example, young victims of trafficking, young asylum seekers who might also be victims of trafficking, we know that many of them have very sort of atypical developmental backgrounds in the sense that they may have been separated from their parents at a very early stage. They may not have received any schooling, any formal training. So they might on one hand be very independent because they have had to take care of themselves and maybe had adult-like relationships or working at a very young age. But on the other hand, they might be very lacking in emotional development and in of course academic training, etc. So they might have a profile that is very untypical for then typically developing children who develop in safe contexts. And again, this is why our reliance on how we would interview in Sweden Swedish children with certain unique experiences, it can work to some extent, but we have to think about ways to improve or to take into account these particular aspects. And Another article that I would recommend that is looking at these things is the one here by Lorraine Hope and a long list of colleagues. My team and I have written a very small part of this as well, but it's researchers all over Europe looking at different aspects in which cultural issues are of relevance, and it's more of an opening towards what we need to look more carefully into. Anthropologists have long talked about the differences between so-called collectivistic and individualistic cultures. And there is, although of course, there's always a risk of being too stereotypic when saying that African or Eastern countries are more collectivistic and Western European countries are individualistic. There does seem to be quite a grain of truth in the notion that countries like the US, for example, and many Western European countries are very focused on the self, on the people are remembering their own experiences, and then cultures like, as I mentioned earlier, traditional Asian cultures, for example, there is a much stronger focus on the family, on the larger social group, or in many Arab countries, etc. And this really may affect how we remember situations and interactions and what we choose to remember, what is important. It's maybe not then my deeds, but what has happened in the extended family. This can be seen in many times in many ways in different criminal investigations. So that, for example, the matter of psychological control in the case of trafficking, the actual psychological control might not be perpetrated by someone here in the country where we are now, but rather by a parent or another relative in the country of origin. And even over that distance, that may have really an enormous effect. Also, the fact that the question of the shame of the family, as you would know who are familiar with these types of what is called crimes of honor-related crimes, the issue of families is important in a way that is hard to imagine in, for example, Northern European countries of like typically cultural Finns, for example. Interaction dates, the role of oneself in relation to others, these are all very culture bound. There was one case here in Finland where it created quite a surprise, or it was a great disbelief about the fact that a mother would not remember the year of birth of her child, which I guess for many Northern European persons it would be completely unimaginable. But on the other hand, we have to realize that without calendars and without this tendency to report dates very often, dates would not have that meaning to us either, and that in especially if among illiterate populations where calendars are not used, where the most important thing of passing of time has to do with cultivating or with other very concrete matters, there is not so much of a point maybe in remembering exact dates. So here we need to be aware of our own lenses of the way we look at the world. As I mentioned earlier, I've been working with training interpreters, and I must say that this training has very much gone both ways. I've learned, I think, at least as much as the interpreters in these trainings. We now have the third course for these interpreters started yesterday. And these are all registered court interpreters who are now specializing in child forensic interviewing. And many of them have extensive experience. Many of them have also worked with asylum processes, for example, or child protection. And it's quite clear that issues such as sexuality and sexual terms are incredibly culturally sensitive. Gender issues, I mean, we know already, of course, that you have to make sure if you have a female victim, especially from a culture where it's not natural for women to talk about sexuality with men present, that you have to make sure that the victim can choose a person of their own gender if they like. In many languages, you use euphemisms for sexual words. And there simply may not be a word, for example, for intercourse that people would use, but you would talk about sleeping together or something similar. They can have very distinct meanings, these terms, but they will not correspond exactly to intercourse. Idiomatic expressions can be problematic. There are sayings such as, I will tear the eyes out of your face if you don't obey, which sounds very bad if translated directly from one language to another, but which in a given language can mean you should do your homework, and it can be something completely non-serious. So here, of course, we need to have this discussion with interpreters of if there are idiomatic expressions, please also tell me what this expression typically means. And there may be false friends. For example, among different versions of English in I think it was Western African countries, a word like beat might include any kind of physical contact or pushing or whatever, not only beating with the hand. So we should be very aware, even if we think we know the language at hand. It's also been found in studies that interpreters sometimes may refrain from using the words the child themselves have used if they are too explicit, or to ask very explicit questions from the child, sort of to protect the child, for example. And this, of course, may be a terrible problem in an investigative interview. And this again has maybe to do with the fact that at least in Finland, and I think this is the case as far as I've read in many other countries as well, there's a lack of trained interpreters, and there's also a lack of preparing together with the interpreters. So at least in Finland, interpreters may be called to a child abuse interview without knowing even what the theme is about, and they may be quite shocked to find out that it's about the rape of a small child. And I think it certainly would be necessary for their psychological well-being to have a possibility to prepare themselves for this, and maybe opt out if it's a topic they really think they cannot deal with, and also to go through to prepare for the interview and to take the mindset of doing an investigation, because I think that in itself is a bit protective. Then you are not only passively hearing, you are actually actively doing something that may improve the situation. I think that is what is actually helping many interviewers as well to be confronted with these terrible topics, is that you can still maybe do something to improve the situation. Preparation and training for and with interpreters and interviewers would be really important. And we need to decide before the interview what to do if something is impossible to translate directly, if there's a word with many different meanings, and how to express if one doesn't understand. Some of the interpreters have been training, for example, from Southeast Asian countries, have said that in for example, I think it was the Thai translator who said that in her culture it's very impolite or it's like rude to say that you didn't understand. So there might be quite a barriers also for the interpreter to say that they have not understood. And these are things that need to be discussed, of course, before the interview to avoid problems. And I think we won't be at a stage where all interviewers know all cultures, but we really should understand how much there is we don't understand, this kind of Socratean wisdom and interest and ability and time to try to go through these things together, for example, with the interpreter before the interview. It's also important to note that the interpreter in the interview, the interpreter's task is to interpret, nothing else. They should not be there as to be a cultural interpreter or help solving the case, but they might be able to provide information through discussing the language about the cultural context before the interview. Here is a video for our sign language interpreters. I am a little bit proud to say I think we have been the first country to have a particular training for also sign language interpreters. They created this kind of video for other sign language interpreters where they do the NICHD protocol in Finnish sign language. Other words, other terms that are difficult to translate that may be lost in translation are things like people. In Finnish, it's simple. You say hän, and it means he or she or them or whoever, regardless of age and status. Already in Swedish, it's more complicated. It's like in English, there's he and she, although in Swedish, this word hen has been now taken into use, so it can be either or. And in English, increasingly, we talk about them if we don't want to define gender or yeah. But in many countries, in many languages, it's very clearly gender bound, and not only that, it can be also referring to a particular position or age or other things that really it can be very hard to ask in a neutral way. Has someone done anything bad to you, for example? Family relations can be difficult to understand. Brothers and uncles can mean a lot of different things in different cultures. In sign language, one of the difficulties is to pose open-ended questions. Also, some languages are much more neutral than others. Again, for example, Finnish is an incredibly neutral language where very few words have like an implicit loaded negative or positive meaning. But many things that, for example, if you in English would ask, well, can you tell me about a recent experience? I would say that's pretty neutral, the word experience. But if translated into Arabic or Russian, this word, or the word that typically is used, could actually be a word that is negative or positive, which could very much influence what the child chooses to focus on. And again, if the interviewer does not know that in the practice interview we want to talk about neutral things, we don't want to go into sad stories, not necessarily only funny either, we want to have like anything that comes to mind, then it might be much more difficult to interpret this correctly. The interpreter really needs to understand what is the point of this phase. The research on using or working with interpreters in child interviews or interviews in general, it's sad reading. There's a lot of challenges, both when you ask the interpreters and when you ask interviewers. And I think it's quite clear, based on the research that there is, that people would like to see more certified interpreters in court, and also planning and training together. And this is really one of the things I think I would like to change, if I could change some things for the better in terms of in the field of child interviewing, and particularly relevant for the trafficking cases, is to really plan together with interpreters and get all that background information that they have, so we can together think of how to address issues in a good way. And in the case of trafficking victims, I think, since one of the big problems is the reluctance to talk about their experiences, we really need a cultural sensitivity. We really need to find the right ways to explain that we are on their side, or trying to help them talking about their experiences. And I think as a Finnish interviewer, I could not do that alone. I really need a person who talks that language and is aware of the culture. And I'm stressing that the interpreter doesn't need to perform the role of a cultural expert, because they are interpreters. But I think many of these issues actually come through discussing words and language. There is relatively little research, but Lauren Wilson, who I heard in an excellent presentation a few conferences ago, talked about precisely interpreting in trafficking cases. And this is an example where she has transcribed both what the interviewer said and what the translation was. And you can see here, well, when you say tried to have sex, can you explain what you mean by tried? Translation: when you say he tried to have sex, what are you referring to? What are you saying? Meaning I was trying to keep him as far away from me as possible. I was trying to keep him as far away as possible from me. I think this translation is good, I must say. It's impressive work that interpreters do when immediately translating. So thanks again officially now to our translators today. Sorry for speaking quickly. Officer, at any point had she touched him? Had she put her hand on his penis? Was he aroused? Was he hard? Here the officer is posing such a complex question, it's not easy to translate. Have you tried at some point, or did you touch him, or was he excited? Well, also the translation is not really. Yes, I tried to push him away because he was on top of me and I no longer had air. He was very fat, very big. I was trying to push him away because he was on top of me and I couldn't breathe properly because he was also very big. And I think here, really, I think it probably cannot be much better than this, but still we can clearly see that some of the emotional value at least goes missing, and these so really these things need to be focused on, and you can see Lauren's PhD, which is about interpretation more generally, and it's also found online. A word like child sexual abuse is not readily available in every languages in every language. A word for intercourse, for genitals, the same thing. Actually, very few languages seem to have child-friendly and precise words for genitals, and this particularly goes for female genitals. We've had now in the two previous groups of interpreters, we've been discussing this, and it seems much more common that boys can name their genitals in child-friendly ways than for girls. In Sweden, there was a very much debated case recently where a little girl talked about her snippa, which is a rather recently introduced term for the female genital, which is very nice and child-friendly and also very exact in terms of what it is about. And she was interviewed and talked about sexual abuse by a man, and in the court very much criticized court decision. Judges assessed in the appeal court that it couldn't be really sure what she meant with snippa. And this raised quite a good discussion. I think it's really important that the legal system also understands children's language for their body parts, but also that we have body part names, of course. Anyway, many languages might have euphemisms that are like give exact meanings, like sleeping together, and these need to be known. Then we have to ask, of course, the translator, interpreter, preferably before the interview, if we know we're going to talk about sexual abuse, what is the word for intercourse? What is the commonly used word for rape? Oh, there is not such a word. What would be typical ways to talk about it then? And then it's been found in some studies that interpreters may actually be shy to use the children's terms. So that's another possible problem. This I actually already said. And this I actually already talked about. So the recommendation here would be to train interviewers and interpreters together. Interpreters not only need to know, they need much more than just hearing the question they should interpret. They should know why leading questions need to be avoided. So preparing together and how to ask about these things in a non-leading way and what to do if there are unclarities in the communication. So this should be much more teamwork, and I think we can all learn very much. I know I have just 3 minutes or so, no, 7 minutes left, but I'll try to be briefer. So if there is some question, we could still take that. Just very, very quickly. One problem in these cases is also, that's more maybe than in the court situation, but it is that we still have a problem with putting too much emphasis on how people look and if they cry when they show, or how they show emotions or do not show emotions when they tell about their experiences. This has been found in asylum cases, in rape cases, in all sorts of cases. People are more believed if they show emotions. Here are two examples from the UNHCR report, The Heart of the Matter. What you tell me is not credible. You continue to describe your reasons for fleeing in such a superficial way that I can only believe that you haven't actually experienced this. Or, you told me your story without showing any emotion whatsoever. The determining authority considers this also an indicator of a fictitious story. This is researched. Sara Landström, among others, or in particular, Sara Landström, professor at the Gothenburg University, has studied what is called the emotional witness effect, which shows that when, for example, a rape victim cries, they are more likely to be believed than if they do not show emotions. And this does go against what we know about trauma and difficult experiences and what kind of reactions they lead to. They lead to dozens of different reactions which may occur anytime soon or never. So it's really not a good indicator of truthfulness or credibility. And in the case of trafficking, the perfect victim myth is really one of these problems, that these girls who are encountered, for example, as victims of sexual trafficking may not be the perfect victim kind of girl, but depicted. So for example, in this Swedish article by Johanna Lindholm and colleagues, they wrote that depicted as someone without agency, with no free will, and completely in the hands of the trafficker, the ideal trafficking victim can be seen as diametrically different from the guilty prostitute. So we need to change that mindset in investigators. And I just want to end by echoing Nadine and Rebecca in their report, in need of targeted support. Well, identification of victims is difficult, but I really agree that in the Barnahus model, there are many features that could cater, improve the situation for trafficking victims, and especially the interagency cooperation here is crucial. And I think we should also use this interagency cooperation to think of ways in which to meet the victims in the interview setting, and a special hint for the interpreters and the need for cultural knowledge. So specialized training also for interpreters, and partly together with interviewers, is one of the really key things, I think, here. And it should, of course, be video recorded. This is the last slide. We know that victims lose quite a lot of information from that they're heard on video to that they're heard in court, if one is not using the video material anymore. And for children, time is even more crucial. So I really, one of the things I hope to be able to, that we can see for the future, is that no children would be subject to interrogations in the courtroom many months or even years after they have been exposed to a crime. So that was everything on my part. Thank you. And sorry, Shana, there was not much time now for questions, I realize.
No, but it was a brilliant 4-hour lecture from you. So many gems to pick out from. But I think the best way to end is maybe to ask a question about, so we have a number of participants who are investigative interviews or viewers, or there are people who work in Barnahus. So I think for that group of people, the role of what we have just heard today is very clear. But what about for other types of groups that could be listening in that maybe don't work in a Barnahus, maybe they work in the migration field, for example, or maybe they're working in the police but not connected to a Barnahus right now. What do you want these groups to take away from today into their work, keeping in mind the importance of, not discrediting the child, not contributing to discrediting the child, and second, re-victimization and so forth?
Yeah. Well, I think one thing is that, for example, the persons providing support, be it whatever kind of support, any kind of interaction actually with victims of trafficking, I think any trust in any other authority will make it easier also for those working within criminal investigations to be trusted. I think like building the idea that there are people who can be trusted also apart from the perpetrator, because this really seems to be one of the major issues, is that victims who have no one to trust are really in the hands of the perpetrators. And I think there it could be, it's someone's, it's been found with abused children that it can really be anyone, any person who is in the context of the child, who suddenly becomes like that one that is so important that the child manages to sort of go on. And so I think that's one thing, not to be too poetic. But I also think normally, I mean, we would always warn professionals, especially if we talk about younger children, to sort of interrogate them or interview them outside of the interviewing room. But at the same time, of course, it must be said that there is really, really no danger in listening to children and ask them generic things of how they are and sort of help them come to maybe realizations about their situation. And this might indeed be really necessary. Then maybe another thing, of course, is to talk about these factors, psychological coercion and control, and this position of the victims more, so it's seen. And then I'm particularly worried about this young these children who commit criminal acts, who are solely viewed as perpetrators. I think really we might have a lot of children who are in incredible vulnerable positions, and so there we have to look more carefully.
Great. Julia, thank you so much for an incredible day today. Thank you all so much for joining us. We were fluctuating between 60 to 71 participants all morning today. Thrilled that we could support you with this topic. You'll hear more from us very soon, and wishing you all a great weekend. Thank you.
Thank you.